Oma. Okay. Ya Devi Sarva Bhuteshu Shakti Rupena Samstita Namastasye 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 Namo Namaha. Salutations to that goddess who empowers all beings. Yathagner Dahika Shakti Ramakrishna Sthita Hiya Sarva Vidya Swarupam Tam Saradam Pranamamyaham Saradam Pranamamyaham Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayoshitva Pranamami Muhur Muhur. We bow to that energy that is inseparable from God, that Shakti which is like heat to a fire, the power by which fire can burn. We salute that Shakti, Sarada Devi, the giver of essence. May she sit upon our tongue and illumine our intellects. May this be an offering to that goddess who is embodied as all the mantras and all the vidyas. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Ganeshaya Namaha. Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Hari Om. Good evening. So you'll recall last week we had a very sophisticated discussion, I think, and an important discussion because it's about the tension that we feel in this tradition between tradition, or rather conservative convention, and innovation or spontaneity and a heartfelt, individual-oriented, personal connection to reality. And therefore the two of them are in stark contrast with one another, and they support one another, and the creative tension that they create alongside one another is really the heart of this entire lineage. Actually, in a few moments I'll go across the room and grab a record, because there's this beautiful record. It's called the Bauls of Bengal. And I was lucky because when I was in Tarapit, I had the chance to stay for a little while with one of the disciples of Purnadas Baul, Haridan Das Baul. And while I was there, I was in Boshua. I had a wonderful opportunity to move with Bauls and see how they live and what their devotion looks like. And there's nothing really like that in this world, I think. And there's something about it that's very important for us to think about, since Sri Ramakrishna is very much a Baul at heart, and his philosophy is very Baul-oriented. In fact, Rabindranath Tagore, the first non-European or non-Westerner to win a Nobel Prize in literature, actually, for his Gitanjali. So he, importantly, sort of restored the reputation of Bauls in India. It's an interesting thing because prior to Rabindranath Tagore, the Bauls actually had a bad reputation. They still do. I mean, I was with Haridan Das Baul, and there are temples that you won't go into, arguably, because there's still a lot of discrimination against the Bauls. But if it weren't for the Bauls, arguably we wouldn't have the Rolling Stones. There's a clear connection between the Bauls and that tradition and what you would later call bohemian culture in Paris. And they would call them bohemians a lot of the times because they lived in a part of town in old Paris that was the bohemian quarters. Because back then, the Czech Republic, Prague, was called the Kingdom of Bohemia. And so it was east. It was to the east of Western Europe. So anybody coming into Western Europe from the east was naturally going to be called a bohemian. And not just because of that, because they, often lived in that part of town that was considered the bohemian quarters. Now, also, one thing to note is that this was the cheaper part of town. So lodging and accommodation was much cheaper here. So if you're emigrating into Paris, or into any Western European city from the East, if you're a traveling band of minstrels or nomads or refugees even, probably you look for cheap housing or a place where you can stay, given that you don't have any contacts there. And so you would go to places like this. Lower East End New York, for instance, had a reputation for attracting such people. And these places are usually very artistic places, very creative places, because ideas from outside the nation would come and mingle with ideas within the nation, and that would create a revolution of thought, a revolution of culture, a revolution of food, cuisine even, and of course, naturally, spirituality. So the Bauls, we'll get to that in a bit, but the Bohemians, let's start with that. The Bohemians, a lot of them were also known as gypsies, which of course can be used pejoratively. It's a somewhat derogatory term, and therefore it's not quite politically correct anymore to say that word. But when we think about why they were called gypsies, a few theories are given. One of them is that they used to be considered to be, people used to think that they were Egyptians, because they were, again, coming from the east. So Bohemians, because the kingdom of Boheme, or Bohem, was over there to the east. And not just that, they were living in the Bohemian quarters, and they were mostly Easterners, Persian-looking, Indian-looking, brown people, So naturally you would say, oh, they're from Egypt. They're Gyptos. And so the Gypto word becomes gypsy, as it were. But recent genetic studies, I think, have proven quite reasonably beyond a doubt that these are most likely northwestern Indians or northeastern Indians that moved into Europe from North India for various reasons. So the gypsies are not really from Egypt, rather they're from India. And not just from India. Obviously the Romani people includes a much bigger subset than just Indians, but a vast majority of them actually in the beginning were Indians. And over the course of hundreds of years, they would mix with various cultures. And so they would be these Habiru type wandering peoples that were assimilating various different cultures. But the one thing that was associated to this community was like magic and Orientalism and spirituality. So often the caricature of the quote-unquote gypsy or the Romani person was as a fortune teller, someone who had a crystal ball, or someone who had tarot cards. That's interesting because the tarot tradition developed in Italy, but arguably it's the tarot and fortune telling and all of that that was associated to the gypsies, or to the Romani people, to be more politically correct. Now, when they would settle, often in a town, they would be outside the town, not necessarily in the bohemian quarters. They would sometimes set up camps outside the town, as you know. And these places were usually very colorful places. The tents would be very colorful, bright colors, garish colors, and there'd be a lot of music. So another thing, besides spirituality, besides mysticism, besides Orientalism, was also art and creativity and music. These were associated to the to the Bohemians or to the wandering nomadic Romani people also. So notice guitars, lutes, violins, they're often to be found in these camps, and usually at night they would sit around a fire and make music. And often they would also be very festive. So they would like drink. And so the Romani people were associated with a kind of bacchanalia, sort of degenerate partying sort of vibe, you know. And so naturally, a very conservative Christian Europe looked upon them as degenerates. And Baul music was, of course, I keep saying Baul when I mean to say Romani, or in other words, gypsy. But the gypsy people, arguably the Romani people, were very musical, but the kind of music they were bringing into Western Europe was also very unique. It would mingle with Western European styles. So, you know, you get like Django Reinhardt, that's a good example, where it's like jazz music. It's Western jazz music, but with a lot of Eastern influence. So you're likely to hear like Rag Bhairava or Rag Bhairavi, and maybe later I'll grab a guitar and like show you what those sounds are like. But sometimes in the Western musical tradition, they're called gypsy scales, which nowadays no music institution will say. So academically now we call them Hungarian scales. But notice, even the word Hungary, like say Prague or Hungary, these are all east of Western Europe. These are Eastern European places. So a Hungarian scale is just the word that Western Europe sometimes uses for these ragas, these musical phrases that come from India. And not just from India, but also from Central Asia and from various parts of the quote-unquote Orient or from the East. And often they have a very mysterious, mystical sort of sound. So when it's employed in Western music, it of course implies Orientalism, but it also implies like transcendental themes of magic and mystery and fortune telling, and in the best case, God and spirituality, but a spirituality that was different from the buttoned down, conservative, rule-oriented, belief-based Western spirituality. So the Western institutions like the Roman Catholic Church and whatnot were obviously very threatened by Romani people and the kind of culture they were bringing into the West, like partying, joy, but more importantly, religion oriented around partying and joy, a religion that seemed to invite humanness, invite joy and celebration. That's the kind of thing that most institutions fear. Like, look at King James, for instance. There's a clear moment when King James decides to retranslate the Bible. He retranslates the Bible. And there's a clear moment when he chooses to read the word pharmakia, which in the book of Exodus in the Greek might mean something like, I don't know, poisoner maybe? Somebody who poisons others? Like, that's of course very despicable. Because if you have a problem with somebody, maybe you should fight them. That's honorable actually at that time, to like challenge them to a duel or to fight them face to face. It was dishonorable to kill them secretly through poison. Also, it's kind of like, I mean, you just want to have a meal, you know? The world in which there are poisoners is a world in which you're scared to eat a meal, and you need to hire somebody to come and eat the meal for you before you taste it, and then that person might die. So poisoners are, of course, very detestable, contemptible types, because, you know, often they're shady and they're killing people surreptitiously in a way that makes life so inconvenient for everybody. So we don't like poisoners, arguably, and so the word pharmakia might very likely refer to that. Suffer not a poisoner to live. That's what the word pharmakia might imply. It could also imply, obviously, because pharmacy, pharmakia, drug user or drug dealer, somebody who gives narcotics. Like at that time, it would have been like laudanum or something, opiates like that. But I don't really know what the word pharmakia means. And I don't think anybody else does either, because these things are words that are used in certain cultural contexts that are lost to us. We weren't living in Alexandria in the 2nd century AD. We don't know what they meant by the word pharmakia. And we certainly don't know what the compiler of that text meant. But King James, arguably, he had a particular meaning in mind that he wanted to use. And that meaning was witch. So what it ultimately comes out to in the book of Exodus, in the King James Bible, is suffer not a witch to live. As you know, that would have serious consequences, not just for Western Europe and for much of the world, but even for America. Like even here in Salem, there were women, very powerful, strong women who, many of them were, by the way, like widows, I guess. They were married, and then they like lost their husbands. Maybe their husbands died or something. I was recently in Salem, and it wasn't like this, like, large-scale inquisition or something like that. It was select individuals in society that were killed on charges of witchcraft. But a lot of times it was probably because they were the kinds of people that society didn't like, and most of the time it was just because they were independent, headstrong women. So I went to one place, a restaurant now actually, it's a seafood restaurant, but it's a place associated with a particular woman who was killed. And it used to be her house or something like that. So I was reading about her. You know, in the restaurant, there's like this biography of her. And they say they can still see her ghost walking up and down the stairs. So naturally, I was poking around, but no, she was shy. And I was like, okay, I hope she's out having fun, actually. I hope she's not home right now. Because she was the kind of woman who would rarely be home. She would always be out. And often she was accused of being promiscuous. She would be visiting various men. She would be doing her own thing. And of course, that itself is problematic, that there's a woman who doesn't have a husband, who is comfortable going outside, who is independent and creative and just doing her own thing. And of course, naturally, that meant that she was a bacchanal, a degenerate, drinking and drugging and like having promiscuous sex or whatever. So really, arguably, she was killed for that. She was killed for her eccentricity, for her individuality, for her independence, which as a woman is a mortal sin in many cultures. So a lot of times, these were just women who were targeted and picked on by their society because they were so ahead of their time. And so they were burnt at the stake. One almost remembers Giordano Bruno, or these great like Western mystics and philosophers who just disagreed with the thought currents of their day and age. So Giordano Bruno, for instance, he was one of the first people to suggest that the earth wasn't the center of the universe, like Galileo or whatever. And that was, of course, against the church doctrine. But not only that, he was also a revolutionary in that he was willing to use Jewish Kabbalistic ideas within a Gentile Christian context. So Giordano Bruno was one of these Italian, like, Renaissance magicians who would talk about the Kabbalah and use the Sephiroth and then equate that to Christian ideas. So he kind of revolutionized Christian mystical thought, which of course is hugely problematic because any new ideas will first be detested and resisted before accepted and made commonplace. So he was burnt at the stake. Because he just had a different idea than everyone else. Galileo wasn't quite so dramatically dealt with, but he was put under house arrest, right? He was told to recant his view that the earth was not the center of the universe. And when he wouldn't, he was locked in his house for a while. Which for somebody like that is not a bad thing. You know, he can just read his books. I didn't really strike me as the kind of guy who liked to go outside a lot anyway. So people like Kepler, Galileo, these are all people who thought differently and spoke about what they thought. And naturally, that's a big problem. But they were also men. So think about all the martyrs of Christianity from the very dawn of the inception of that tradition. From that point on, all these great masters of Christianity have been burnt at the stake, allegedly thrown into the den of wolves, allegedly torn to shreds by lions in the Roman Colosseum. Of course, some scholars say many of these stories are exaggerated. They were actually dealt with much more mercifully than this. But there's a certain romance. If this is just a story, it can still be accepted as like a romantic metaphor for what happens when you step out of line. Now, many of these were men. Of course, many martyrs were women, and many of them were even children. There are some children who demonstrated great saint-like resistance to being burned and killed and tortured. But most of them were men. Most of these saints were men. And now notice, if even men like Giordano Bruno are burnt at the stake, or men like Galileo were put under house arrest for thinking differently and for acting differently and for being different, imagine how much more true that's going to be for a woman. For a woman who has a different idea or a different thought current, or who acts that thought current out as an example to other women. I think it was Hannah Arendt, the great philosopher, French philosopher, who said something like, the goal of a human life is to perform public acts that contribute to the human story. Something to that effect. I forget exactly what the French there is. But, notice, I'll just make this point, okay? There are two names that are very famous in philosophy. Let me just make this point first. It was International Women's Day yesterday, and this dovetails very nicely with what I want to talk about today. There are two men in the world of Western philosophy that are very, very famous and very, very important. And in fact, there are three men that I'll mention now. The first is Rilke. He's a poet more than a philosopher, but he wrote these letters to a young poet, and those letters, of course, are read as beautiful, like, inquiries into aesthetic philosophy and the philosophy of poetry and art. So we can consider him a philosopher, although by trade he was mostly a poet. There was another man, Nietzsche, who of course is a much bigger name, who is a household name, and his works like Beyond Good and Evil, Thus Spake Zarathustra, like these are all arguably staples in most philosophy programs. I mean, he's falling out of favor a little bit, but he's somebody that people read and quote a lot and feel proud about having read. Nietzsche, and he's considered to be quite edgy. And he has some very interesting ideas. Like, for instance, he poses this thought experiment where when you get to the end of your life, and say you're given an opportunity to relive your whole life again exactly as it was, if you can say yes to that, if you can assent to living your life again with everything happening exactly like it did, then you've lived a good life. And so we should live in that way, where if we get to the end, we wouldn't mind doing it all over again. Stuff like that. He has beautiful thought experiments. He introduces the idea of the Übermensch, and then he phrases all of this in the context of an Orientalism. Like he talks about this prophet, Zarathustra or Zoroaster, who goes to a mountain and then has his realization, and then comes back to teach the foolish townspeople how to become empowered. And more importantly, he spoke out against the church, spoke out against institutionalized religion, because he felt like they were just training people to be slaves and sheep, disempowering them, making them feel weak. So in a very Vivekananda-esque way, Nietzsche was saying to people, of course he was very fond of, I think, nitrous and whip, he did a lot of whippets allegedly, but you can imagine in a kind of whippet-induced days, Nietzsche is like full of fervor, and like Vivekananda, who I don't think did whippets, but I don't know, he was like, you guys, stop listening to the church when they tell you that you're weak. That's just a disempowering slave mentality. It's like creditor-debtor mentality that you don't need to buy into. So Nietzsche speaks out against the church, and he introduces the idea of the Übermensch, and then more importantly, introduces a somewhat Orientalist philosophy of becoming, where you like evolve into this super person, this Übermensch, which always sounds better in German, always sounds much more serious and real, like Übermensch. Wow. What an idea. Of course, the reason why Nietzsche has become very politically incorrect in some circles is because that Übermensch idea was, of course, co-opted by the Nazi party. And Nietzsche's sister was very much affiliated with the early National Socialists. And so she would bring Nietzsche's works into those circles. And just like Vivekananda is sometimes co-opted by a Hindu nationalist narrative, just like that, Nietzsche's philosophy was co-opted often by Nazi narratives also. Like, we as a German people have to aspire to become the master race because we are inherently powerful. And the problem here is the idea that we're more powerful than everyone else. Though Nietzsche, arguably, in this case, is speaking to a common divinity, common to all human beings. And so, again, in a nitrous whippet-like induced days, he would say things like, I don't want to believe in a God that doesn't laugh or dance, things like this. So you can see he's championing an idea that's very edgy. So Nietzsche is often the edgelord par excellence, and this whole beyond good and evil thing where he talks about morality as nothing but a system of creditors and debtors and whatnot. He's a remarkable philosopher, a brilliant mind, and of course very prolific. And so Nietzsche is a big name in Western philosophy. And another name here is Sartre, and of course associated with Camus as well. These two are French, Nietzsche was German. And Sartre and Camus were both existentialists in that they were asking the question, what is it to be a human? Like, what is it to make meaning in this universe? Is there inherent meaning? Remember, as long as there is a church, as long as there is institutionalized religion, they can control the narrative as to what a human life is about. Because they can tell you there is an absolute meaning in this universe, and that is to get right with God, to seek moral rectitude. And to do that, you better be paying the church tithes. You better go to church, and when the hat gets passed around, you better put your money in that hat. And more importantly, you better do exactly as your priests and institutional authorities tell you to do. Because if you don't, you as a human being will fail to meet the universal and absolute standard for what it means to live a meaningful life. Like, you cannot decide for yourself what a meaningful life would constitute outside of the narrative that your religion is giving you, because it's in the book. You know, anytime you try to articulate a sense of meaning outside of that, it's heresy, it's blasphemy. You should try to do what the church tells you. And so when Camus and Sartre are presenting this sort of relativist existentialism, notice how challenging that is for that view. Because if the view says there is an absolute meaning in the universe, when Sartre and Camus tell you there isn't, that this is in fact a meaningless universe in which you as a meaning-making creature are free to make whatever meaning you want, that's liberating actually. It means you no longer have to do what the church tells you. You can do what your heart tells you. And I will give this to Camus. Sometimes people don't take him seriously as a philosopher. They try to relegate him into the realm of literature, and they say, you know, he's not really that unique as a philosopher. But I don't know, I think he does contribute a few things. One thing I think that's quite interesting about Camus is that it's not just about making your own meaning based on what you care about and what you want. It's also about doing that in a way that other people can also be inspired by. So when other people see you perform your meaning-making attempt, when you go out into the world and live life the way that you think you should, then other people can add that to their own conception of meaning. So they can look at the church and they can say, okay, this is what the Roman Catholic Church tells me would constitute a meaningful life. But then look at all these people out there in this camp with their colorful tents. They're sitting around the fire, passing around some country liquor, and they're singing songs about God. And more importantly, their God doesn't only seem to be living and vital, but it's a God that laughs and sings and that likes when they're happy. It's a God that arguably maybe is even feminine in nature. They might even be singing songs about mother as opposed to God the Father. And so you look at what the church is offering. Not that that's bad. It's at least one story. It's only bad when it's like oppressively given as the only thing. Then you look at what the quote-unquote gypsies, or more politically correct, the Romani people are doing out there. And you look at what the people around you are doing. You look at what the people in the Bohemian quarter are doing. And then you think, what do I want to do? And now you can bounce off all of these other things. If they weren't doing those things publicly, if they were doing it secretly, like off to the side somewhere, and sometimes they tried, they went to the jungle or the forest outside of town because they knew that if they were to like sit around a fire like in the city itself and pass around a bottle of liquor and sing joyous songs about God, that might not go over so nicely in a buttoned down, more sober, like restrictive society. So they tried. They went out and set up camps outside, sometimes by necessity, by force, and other times by design. And still they would discover, people would be trading and going up and down the roads and they would notice them. So when you do these things publicly, when you dress how you want and go out of your house, or when you speak how you want, or when you like make the art that you want and then put it out in the world, that's also important. So I think Camus' like existentialism is twofold. One part of it constitutes making meaning for yourself. And you can only do that by going off of what you see around you. So being exposed to various ideas is important so that you can cultivate your own idea. That's why when I get these like YouTube videos on my algorithm where it's like, look at this famous song. Here are 4 songs that this song rips off. I'm like, dude, like nothing is original. There's nothing in this world that emerged out of nothing. Everything is like a cumulative like discovery that's come from everything before. It's emerging. And it's still new. The beautiful thing about this is that new combinations of old things can still be considered new. Like if Jimi Hendrix were to listen to like blues music, if he listens to B.B. King, and then he listens to Bob Dylan, who has like a more folk orientation, and then he plays music that combines both of those things, then are you saying that he's ripping off Bob Dylan and B.B. King? In a sense, yes. He did play in the B.B. King band. Of course, B.B. taught him so many things. And he did listen obsessively to Bob Dylan. And yet, he's Jimi Hendrix. There's like something unique about him. And he's bringing in Native American culture that he inherits from his mother. He's bringing in this, like, the song Voodoo Child. He's bringing in his own spirituality, which he was very interested in. Like Napoleon, Jimi Hendrix also got a tarot reading towards the end of his life. And he got the death card, like Napoleon. And both of them would very soon after that tarot reading. Both in France, actually. Interestingly, I think it was in Paris that Jimi Hendrix got his tarot reading and it foretold his literal death. And it happened, actually, even with Napoleon. Anyway, that aside, you can't say he's ripping off B.B. King or Bob Dylan. In fact, Bob Dylan, in his time, was also considered somewhat of a hack because the folk music circles didn't like that he was playing black music. He, as a white man, would wear black sunglasses, take out an electric guitar, and start playing blues, which was a huge problem at places like, what's the name of that festival? Joan Baez's festival? It's like a big, Monterey, I think. There's a big California folk music festival. But Bob Dylan was very controversial because he had played that folk festival as a folk musician until one day he didn't. Until one day he got on stage with a band, not just with a banjo, but with a band. Not just with a guitar and with a harmonium, harmonica. Not just with a guitar and a harmonica. He got on stage with a full band, and despite being warned by his friends and supporters not to do that kind of music, he did that kind of music. He was booed off stage. I think it was a whole controversy. And there's like a whole documentary or book on it. It's called Dylan Goes Electric or something. But notice he's doing something different. And people like Johnny Cash and people at that time who liked the innovation were supportive of it. But people who used to be his friends, who thought that he was a folk musician, felt really bad about the fact that he was breaking from tradition and doing something new. But was it really something new? Because he was just listening to blues musicians. He was listening to what the black artists of his time were doing. He was deeply inspired by it, and he couldn't resist the feeling in his heart to also incorporate that in his music. He loved it, and we only do and say and act out what we love. So because Bob Dylan loved that kind of music, it naturally came through. But when it came through him, there was something different about it. There was a folk element to it that arguably enriched black music as well. Because here's Jimi Hendrix, who is an African-American musician, listening to an American folk artist and loving it. And some black artists at that time had a problem with Jimmy being so versed in quote-unquote white music. So people like Jimmy are very important because they're liminal figures. You can't quite say that they're black artists or white artists. They go beyond all notions of race or gender or creed, and they just make what they love. And that's always going to be challenging and exciting. So again, can you say Jimmy is ripping off B.B. King? If you say that, then B.B. King is ripping off, I don't know, Blind Lemon Jefferson or something. How can you can't point to anything and say it's completely original. It had to come from something else. And yet it's new because anytime anybody tries to do something someone else did, they will always fail to reproduce it exactly. What comes out will somehow be new. That's the entire theory of Shakta and Shaiva metaphysic, as we'll come to in a bit. So this newness is important. When we come back to somebody like Camus and his existential theory, notice the newness is only possible when we're exposed to what's there already. So when we have access to books and literature, when we can read and watch, and when we can go out into the city. That's why cities are so important, because they expose you to so many different cultures, and that's why you get a lot of art there. Think of Marcel Duchamp and Lower East End, think of Patti Smith and that whole thing. It's like you need a poor part of town where lots of different international groups will come and live, so that you have this kind of confluence of ideas, a sort of liminality, which is chaotic, and in that chaos, incredibly creative. How wonderful. So Camus and Sartre, in their existentialism, they're almost saying that you don't have to believe any one narrative for meaning is absolutely true. You are free to come up with your own narrative. And that's your power as a human being. You can be forced to push a rock up a hill, but you'll never be forced to think any which way about it. You can come up with your own narrative around why you're doing that and what you're doing even. So even though what you're doing is pushing a rock up a hill for eternity, in your mind, you can make meaning out of that. You could say, oh, this is a struggle for independence, or this is an articulation of character or something. You can come up with your own narrative. That's your right. But that narrative will always be influenced by what you see around you. Okay, the reason I bring up these three people, Camus, Sartre, and actually Rilke and Nietzsche, these four men, is because I also want to point to two women, two very, very important women whose names are, of course, totally forgotten. It's my International Women's Day spiel, which is every day, of course, in a Shakta world. But check this out. There was a woman who was involved in this kind of love triangle with both Rilke and Nietzsche. Her name was Salomé. And Louis von Salomé, the thing about her that's so cool is that she was like those Salem witches, arguably, who would be burnt at the stake and killed for being eccentric and independent and unladylike. So Salomé used to hang out with a lot of guys because she was a philosopher. There's a movie about her, actually. I forget what it's called. I think it might even be called Salomé, I don't know. And her name is so beautiful, because Salomé, Herod, and I don't get into that. But Salomé, she wasn't like the other girls, arguably, because she didn't like what she was told to like. And she was bold enough to actually do what she liked, which a lot of other people in her peer group didn't feel the courage to do. So she would hang out in salons and cafes, a place that women usually weren't welcome in or felt unsafe in. And she would smoke cigarettes with the boys and talk philosophy. They would discuss all manner of things. And importantly, when we think about Nietzsche or we think about Rilke, we see that a lot of their ideas might have actually been influenced by Salomé. She might have had those ideas first, or in conversations with Salomé, they might have come to those conclusions, and then later they would be remembered for it. Not that Salomé would have cared, I don't think. She was a bit too powerful for that. But it's important, I think, that so much of Rilke's poetry comes from that love that he had with Salomé. So much of Nietzsche's greatest insights comes from Whippets, and also his genius, Whippets, and importantly, his frustration, because arguably he was in love with Salomé, but Salomé always chose Rilke. So you could see there's a kind of edgelord emo angst to Nietzsche, and you can see there's a sort of sublimity to Rilke, and both of them arguably are inspired and influenced by this muse, Salomé, who was much more than a manic pixie dream girl muse. She was a philosopher and a poet in her own right, an intellect in her own right, and above all, an individualist, unlike anyone else at her time. And therefore, she inspired a whole new generation of women, like Hannah Arendt. So Hannah Arendt is another woman who, of course, they super did her dirty, in the kind of Nazi time, because she was kicked out of universities, and we don't have to get into it now, but she had a tough time as a philosopher. But she might have been the first one to articulate this idea, actually, that the purpose of a human life is public acts that contribute to the human story. So notice how Shiva and Shakta this framing is. The whole thing is a story. It's a human story, but in the Shiva world we expand that to say it's the entire cosmos. And it's a story, it's a leela, it's an act. And each and every one of us is playing a role. And in the Bhagavad Gita, the only instruction there is to play your role, whatever the fuck it is. In fact, I think I would even make an argument that Duryodhana is not the bad guy here. In fact, I would argue that he's way wiser than Arjuna. Do you notice? In the beginning, before the war, Krishna goes to Duryodhana and he says to him, why are you doing this? You shouldn't. It's adharmic. Right? Notice, it's like the opposite conversation. It's like with Arjuna, he doesn't want to do it because it's adharmic, and Shri Krishna tells him to do it. Isn't that beautiful? Shri Krishna is saying, go and kill your guru, go and fight this war, go and kill some brahmanas, even if it is about to usher in the Kali Yuga. It is your dharma, more importantly, it's your swadharma to do this, even though it's morally ambiguous when you take a big picture view. With Duryodhana, Shri Krishna seems to be taking an opposite kind of direction here, where he's telling Duryodhana not to do this. He's saying, don't go to war against your brothers. In fact, don't exile them. Like, welcome them back with open arms. And Duryodhana says such a beautiful and profound thing that I think will resonate with many of us. He says to Arjuna, he says, I know what I ought to do, but I don't feel like doing it. And I know that what I'm doing should not be done. And yet, I can't help myself from doing it. It's a remarkable thing. Notice, I think what he's saying is that this is my swadharma. This is who I am, who I feel myself to be, and I'm now authentically expressing what I feel. And what I feel is, fuck these guys. I'm jealous of my brothers, and I want them all to die, and I'm pissed off that they humiliated me in their palace, and I just want to kill them. That's what I want to do. And even if it's wrong, even if your morality tells me that I ought not do it, I feel like doing it. And that's what I'm going to obey. Haven't you noticed? And if there's no Duryodhana, there's no Bhagavad Gita. We miss out on the most beautiful teaching, the most sublime teaching that we get in the Puranic world. If there's no Judas, there's no Jesus. Notice, you can't say Judas is problematic here. He's playing a role. And Sri Ramakrishna would often speak this way. When people would say, why do you let these guys hang around you, like Hazara and others? Like they're just troublemakers. And he'll say, there's need for troublemakers too. And he'll refer to an instance in the Leela of Chaitanya where there were some rogues that beat him up and the whole thing was ultimately good. But in the beginning, it was kind of like, oh my God, these are evil actors. They're bad actors. Why does Sri Ramakrishna keep Hazara around? Or why does Chaitanya allow Jatila to hang out or whatever? And you'll see, in the grand scheme of things, it's actually good. But God knows that. We don't know that. So Chaitanya and Sri Ramakrishna, as God, arguably, they make this case that like there's room for troublemakers too. In other words, there are different leelas, and every leela is valid. Every expression of every public act that contributes to the human story is valid, including Duryodhana's decision to wage an adharmic war against his family, against his household. So now on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, Arjuna wants to go to war. Arguably, it's his swadharma to fight, as Sri Krishna will argue here. Basically, Sri Krishna says, your very nature will make you do it. Like, you want to go off to the caves and meditate, but that's not really you, Arjuna. You know, that's what Shri Krishna as a bro is trying to tell Arjuna. Just as his bro, he's saying, yeah, this sounds all high and mighty and holier than thou, to like give up the war and give up the kingdom and like some sadhu go off to the smashan or to the cave and sit there and meditate. That sounds good and your culture will celebrate you for it. But is it really you? The whole thing would be a farce, a pretense. You'd be playing sadhu, but you're not. And by the way, the word sadhu means far more than just someone who sits covered in ash in the cave. The real sadhu, arguably, is someone who is willing to renounce public persecution or pretense. The real sadhu is someone who lives for truth. And whose truth? The truth of your own heart. So here, Arjuna wants to fight. And I can make a case for this. All throughout the Mahabharata, you can see Arjuna is kind of gearing up for this war. He loves archery. After all, he's the best archer of all time, arguably. And how could he be if he wasn't deeply devoted to the craft? So he practices archery all the time. He loves it. He loves fighting. He's a Kshatriya. It's his nature to fight. And not only that, prior to the war, he goes off and does tapasya to gain a weapon from Lord Shiva. Like, he's down to fight. And up until the final moment, he's excited. Almost everyone in that group is wanting to fight. Even the wife, even Draupadi wants to fight. It's only Yudhishthira that's hemming and hawing and resisting going to battle. Yes, it's only Yudhishthira who has a problem with going to war, but ultimately they convince him, ultimately they get on the battlefield, and that's when Arjuna gets cold shoulder. Like, he's like, oh my God, not cold shoulder, we call cold feet. He gets cold feet. Wrong body part, whoops. And Arjuna's like, I don't know about this, you guys. But he does know about it. His heart knows. He wants to fight, but his mind tells him that he ought not fight. He ought not play his role, because now insert all these moralistic arguments that are actually quite good and real and true, just not true to him. So that's what Shri Krishna is arguably telling both Arjuna and Duryodhana, except Duryodhana doesn't need the lesson. He didn't need the Gita. Arguably, he was just going to do what he was going to do. And it was God alone who made him do it. We can talk about free will also in the context of the Gita and in this theology. But here, arguably, Arjuna is going to do it. And Krishna knows that. There's no reason really to have this conversation. But Krishna indulges Arjuna, and we have a Gita. Yes, in fact, the justification for anything is our very being. Like, it will never come. There's no external justification, because in the Gita, you'll see, it was so masterful. Arjuna's argument was so perfect. There was no justification really for doing what he did, except that you can make a case for it. The Gita is one of those texts where you can argue both sides endlessly. But at least according to Arjuna, it would be unjustified for him to go and fight this war. And he makes a good case for why. And Shri Krishna says, yep, true. Now go and fight. I've heard all of your arguments, and this is not justified, but it's just. Even if it's not justifiable, it's just, because it's just what you are. It's what you want to do. It's what your heart will make you do. And there's a very parallel moment when Sri Ramakrishna tells everyone that Swami Vivekananda will teach. He'll teach inside and outside. And he writes, Jai Radha Rani, which is something we can explore later in the Q&A. It's a profound and very esoteric claim that Swami Vivekananda is Radha, actually, because he's the incarnation of prema, pure love. And then later Swami Vivekananda, now Naren, the young boy, 20-something-year-old boy, he's like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go and teach people. I don't want to teach inside or outside. He has this idea that it's wrong to teach. That in fact it would be better to just close your eyes and meditate or focus on his own spiritual life. Like, teaching is not very fashionable, especially not around Sri Ramakrishna, who often spoke to public lecturers and preachers and called them out for teaching swill, for teaching from books and not from life experience. So of course Swamiji, in that atmosphere, would be shy to claim that he was a teacher of men or whatnot. Who can be a teacher? Only God can be a teacher. So when his guru, Sri Ramakrishna, says, you will teach inside and outside, the disciple Swamiji says, I will do no such thing, fuck you. More or less, that's what he said. He's like, I won't do it. I won't teach. And in response, Sri Ramakrishna said, your very bones will make you do it. I don't know what the Bengali is, but that's the translation that I got. Your very bones will make you do it. You've come for that. That's your leela. Your very purpose here is to teach, is to share. And not only share, but to interpret what I taught. And then to deliver it on public stages to everyone, anywhere, anytime. And you are now saying you won't do it. But Shri Krishna is saying to Arjuna, and Shri Ramakrishna is saying to Swami Vivekananda, that while you may say so, the fact is your very bones will make you do it. It's your swadharma. It is your imperative, actually, as a being. We'll call this the swadharma imperative. Insofar as Kant has a categorical imperative, let's have an imperative of our own, the swadharma imperative. The only thing that is imperative, the only thing that is a must in your life is to just be. And what you are will naturally express itself, because no human can just be without expressing that in one way, shape, or form. Even if it's just a thought vibration that they're sending out silently, even that is an expression. Even a thought is, however personal or private it might seem at first, even that is a public act. So I can expand Hannah Arendt's statement quite broadly. The human story, I can expand that to include the entire cosmos. The whole thing is God's story. And I can expand the word public act to include even those thoughts that you think quote-unquote privately. Since, as you know, in other lectures we've explained how the entire universe is internal to consciousness. It's internal to the mind. That being the case, whatever you think is as much a public act as what you do in the world around you. The table that you see in the world there is in your mind. And actually any thought that you think is out there in the world. That's why when you go near someone, you immediately can feel their vibe. Because there's no private thought or personal thought. And I'm not talking about telepathy or anything like that. I'm just saying that all things are in the mind, and therefore what's in your mind is publicly available to all other minds. This is something that Swami Vivekananda explores quite deeply in Raja Yoga. I think Karma Yoga also. No, he explores it in Karma Yoga, because he explains how even thinking is a kind of karma. No one is free of karma. Even a person who sits quietly in a cave meditating is performing karma, an act. And that's a thought. And that thought or that vibration or their meditation is a public act, I will say. And that contributes to the human story. So even that can be included. But the fact of the matter is, your imperative is to just be yourself. And to be yourself is to do what you are here to do, which you cannot actually prevent yourself from doing. You can only hate yourself for it, be guilty about it, be burnt at the stake for it. But if it's really what you're here to do, you can't stop doing it. And dear Rebecca G, it's not quite like that. It's not, you see, you should not restrict or restrain yourself in any way, shape, or form, because what you're thinking is not what you're thinking in that moment, it's what you've thought in every moment of your life. Basically, when I'm talking about thought, I'm not talking about the thought that's here right now, though I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the vibration that is created in your being as a result of repetitively thinking thoughts over a long period of time. That's what people pick up on, not necessarily the specific thoughts. You know, it's not a single thought that makes the vibration. It's lots of thoughts or a same thought repeated over a long period of time. And so there's no need to like police the mind and try to think this as opposed to thinking that. You just are what you are. Do you know? Do you notice? You can't help but think the thoughts that you think because you love what you love and you'll think about what you love. And you love what you love because you are who you are. Duryodhana is who he is, and therefore he must wage war against his brothers. Arjuna is what he is, and therefore no matter how much he wants to be something else, he will have to go and fight this war because his very bones will make him do it. So whether it's a thought or an act, whatever that act may be, I'm going to include thought here, it is public. And that is the purpose of life. According to Hannah Arendt, it is the imperative for every human being to contribute to the human story through their public acts of meaning making. And that's essentially what Camus is going to argue. It's not just about making meaning, it's about doing so in a social way, in an interpersonal way, in a way that contributes to some other person's ability to make meaning. So if you have cool clothes that you love to wear, you might be shamed out of wearing them. You might be told, okay, you're not allowed to wear these clothes out in public because they're not normal. Normal in the sense that they're not what other people are wearing. So other people wear their hair in a particular way, you want to wear your hair in a different way. That's weird. Other people dress in this way and you want to dress in a different way. That's weird. Don't do it. And so if you find a piece of clothing that you love, that you want to wear, you might think, okay, I better not wear it. And why not? Because if I wear it and go out in public, people will laugh at me or shame me for wearing it. And if you decide not to wear the clothes that you want to wear, at that moment, that is adharma. So to this question that is being asked here in the chat, what is adharma? If there is such a thing, I actually don't think there's such a thing as adharma. I'm a non-dualist, so I can't say there's dharma or adharma, and I'll make a case for that later. I don't think there's such a thing as adharma, though our texts speak of it. If there is something called adharma, it is this, not doing your swadharma. So I want to change the word dharma from a moral imperative that is absolute and externally enforced to a moral imperative that is individual and inherent to every individual and different from every other individual. So it's entirely subjective. It's relative and absolute at the same time. It's absolutely true for you, but it's relative to you. Does that make sense? This is a subtle thought, you guys. We all want it to be absolute because that would free you from the responsibility of getting to know yourself. And more importantly, it would free you from the task of courageously expressing yourself, which will often lead, especially if you're a woman, to public condemnation. Remember, all things that are new are first resisted and rejected and persecuted before later accepted and integrated and before later seen as common sense. So the things that are so obvious to us now, like bacteria and germs, were so weird back then when, what's his name? Pasteur was presenting the theory. Back then he was laughed out of academic and scientific circles for suggesting that there were microorganisms, right? Can you imagine? What is so obvious to us now, what is such a big part of our day-to-day lives, was at one point despised, rejected, laughed at, ridiculed. So if there was dharma, notice how convenient for you, because then you would never have to think about what you wanted to do. And how convenient for you, because if you never have to get to know yourself and think about what you want, then you will never have to be put on the spot for performing it. That's what we want. We want somebody to think for us and tell us what to do. And all I have ever done or tried to do is empower others to come to their own conclusions about what they want to do. So it's like I have this Promethean fire called the Tantra and I'm trying to give it to people. But they don't want it. A lot of times, the moment they feel like they can do whatever they want, they immediately turn around and say, this is a failed lineage because I'm not being told what to do. Like, what's the lineage here? What's the accountability? You're only accountable to yourself. I'm only accountable to expressing what is there in my heart. And you, similarly, are accountable only to yourself and what you want to express. That being the case, paradharma meaning externally enforced dharma, the idea of an absolute moral code, and by that I can even include an absolute code of meaning making, that's just so convenient, and that to me is adharma. The idea that any one person has any right to tell another person how to be, what to wear, what to say, what not to say, that to me is adharma. Imposing your own idea of meaning on someone else is adharma. Dharma is that world which empowers everyone to do maximally what they want. And of course, such a world if it existed, would not be very valuable, actually. Because if there wasn't opposition, would it even be meaningful? Do you know what I mean? If it was just so easy to do your own thing, would it be inherently meaningful? I don't know, maybe. I don't think that struggle is necessary, but maybe it is. Maybe it's good that we live in a world where Giordano Bruno will be burnt at the stake for his views, because that just shows you what those views meant to him. He would much rather be burnt at the stake than have to walk away from those things that he loved. Imagine how lovely those things must be. How great God must be if the price of God was to be eaten by lions and you'd be willing to pay that price again and again and again. And if Nietzsche were to ask a martyr, would you live your life again knowing that you were burnt at the stake or mauled by bears or lions in a Roman Colosseum? Would you live it again? The martyr would probably say, yes, absolutely. Because I lived a life of God. And even though I was killed for God, I would gladly be killed again and again for God, because that's just what God means to me. See how beautiful. So say you find a piece of clothing. Dharma would first and foremost constitute in your willingness and acceptance of the fact that you like the piece of clothing. That's step one, That's very hard for people. When we like what we like, we then say we ought not like it. And we have a problem with that. And we have a self-hatred around the various arisings of desire within us. For anything, we want to study something, we want to eat something, or whatever, we have a problem with that. Then, if we can get past that, if we can accept that what we want is okay to want, then to act it out is another obstacle. So if there was such a thing as para dharma, an absolute moral code, one, we would be freed of the responsibility of figuring out who we are and what we want. And secondly, we would be freed of the very daunting task of going out and presenting that in a public act that contributes to the human story. So putting all this together then, what Arjuna is going to do might be contemptible, but he wants to do it. And Sri Krishna is saying, do it. What Giordano Bruno wants to say is contemptible at his time, and he's going to be burnt at the stake for doing it. Probably Sri Krishna, in one way or other, probably also inspired him to do it. Socrates has to drink poison, Jesus is crucified. Nobody who ever innovated was ever free from this public persecution, and yet each and every one of them was more than ready, willing, and able to face it. So think of this example. You find a piece of clothing in a store that you like, and it's not what your kind of person would wear, or what your gender would wear, or what your society thinks is appropriate to wear. So you purchase it, and then you go out with that piece of clothing, and you're the only one in that town that wears that piece of clothing. Now, most people will probably look at you funny or laugh at you or tell you to take it off or whatever, but some people will see it and think, damn, that's really cool, and they'll go and get a similar piece or something like that. That's why in the world of Bohemia, like in the Parisian part of town, you would encounter different styles, different costumes, different ways to dress. And you'd see how that would have an influence on 60s and 70s rock and roll. Like not Joni Mitchell. Oh my God, I'm blanking on her name. With the shawls and the scarves and... Oh, thank you, Janis Joplin. Oh my God. So Janis Joplin would tie all these scarves around her microphones, and later Steven Tyler and Aerosmith would totally appropriate that. He would be so inspired by Janis's use of scarves that he would base his whole stage persona around cloths, scarves and cloths. Now when Keith Richards is gyrating, that move that both Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, when they're doing that move, arguably that's coming from bowls. It's a really remarkable thing. I can point you to the link later, the bhavik link between the bowl movements when they play music, and often on stringed instruments, and the rock and blues movement. Folk music is generally quite the same around the world. But anyway, all of that aside, never mind Kali's image being used as the Rolling Stones icon, put all of that aside for now. You'll just see that so much of art, so much of creativity, it really just comes down to wearing clothes that other people don't think you should wear. You just put these clothes on because you like them, and then you go out into the street and you display publicly these clothes. So fashion is really important. And when the Bohemians or when the Romani people would show up, they would show up often wearing garish colors. Their tents would have color, and they would wear clothes that were flowing and different and gender bending almost. The men would have long clothes, and that was different from the style of that time. Or they would have long hair or beards, where in a culture they were told to shave, they might have long beards, or they might have long hair, or they might wear makeup. That was interesting. Men in these circles might put on a little bit of kohl, which is interesting because generally we don't do that as men in Western European culture. Men don't wear makeup. Yet, in Eastern cultures, men wear makeup all the time. And sometimes in the Bedouin context, men have to wear makeup as a way to protect themselves from the glare of the sun. So then that would inspire poets and artists, and they would start applying eyeliner, or they would start dressing in different ways. And so you'll see in America that whole glam rock thing, and in the 80s, and all of that has its precedent in the 60s and 70s. A lot of fashion and a lot of style was being influenced by Oriental ideas. Clearly with Oriental themes like scarves and shawls and colors, incense, and importantly, kohl, eyeliner. It was kind of a ubiquitous thing among such people. So having said all of that, notice how wonderful it is for such a community to move into Europe, because they brought with them different styles, they brought with them different music, different foods, different languages, and a different metaphysic, because a lot of them were goddess worshippers. Even today, in many parts of Europe, these communities, Romani people, will worship the Black Madonna, and not just that, they will ritually immerse that Black Madonna in a procession during certain festivals. And that's exactly one-to-one what we do in Bengal for Durga Puja. We worship a clay image, who's also often described as black, like Kali. And in fact, isn't it Sara la Kali? Like, I mean, how much more obvious does it need to be here? But Sara la Kali, this Black Madonna, this mother god, is worshipped and then brought to the ocean and immersed. It's so important to remember this, that God is a mother to Romani people. So even when they present as Christian, their theology is different from the Christian theology of their time. Their theology is one of mother God, who naturally is inclusive of things like joy and merriment and fun. Bauls are very kaula in their orientation, very immanent oriented, and very individual and very eccentric. And that eccentricism is persecuted. And importantly, it's the most freeing thing for Western Europe, because it's presenting a new way of life. So when we think about people like Hannah Arendt and how she influenced people like Camus and Sartre, we think of people like Mary Shelley and how her Frankenstein was the best of all the people in the resort, right? They were all in some ski resort in Switzerland or something, and they got snowed in, so they like played a game. They're all writers. And Mary Shelley, who eloped with Percy, right? Shelley, the original Shelley. Anyway, so she eloped with him, and who was it? Byron, right? Was it Byron? They were all in this place together. Again, some weird love triangle thing probably happened. But like, they were in this like cabin together, cabin in the snow, and they were just like, okay, what are we gonna do? Let's all three of us play a game. Let's all write a horror story. And Mary Shelley's one was the best, Frankenstein, right? But notice how wonderful these women were. When we come back to Salomé or Hannah Arendt or someone like Mary Shelley, who was the daughter of a famous feminist, like all of them were individuals and different from everyone else. And in Salem, we saw how that would be persecuted. Do you know how that would be a big problem for society, for a woman to just be herself? It's a problem for anyone to be themselves, but especially I think women, who have a much harder time being themselves, because it might be threatening to men to see women who they rely upon, like serve them chai or something like that, decide not to do that. Instead of being at home and acting like a piece of furniture that makes coffee, what if that piece of furniture who makes coffee decided to like leave and travel and become a saint? That would be terrible, because then how would you, as a man, get your coffee? Oh fuck, we better persecute any woman who threatens to take away this coffee that we would get every morning. You know, like, what the fuck? There is a high price to pay for things that are new. But there is nothing new under the sun. It's just a willingness to do what you want to do. And that contributes to everything else, and then it all checks and balances. When we look at the Bhagavad Gita, it was right for Duryodhana to do what he did, even though what he did is contemptible on many levels. And it was right for Arjuna to do what he did, even though what Sri Arjuna is doing is also contemptible on many levels. The reason it was right for them to both act in the way that they did is because it was the role allotted to them in the Leela. It was their way of performing a public act that contributes to the human story. So that's why I want to read to you a little bit from the back of this record that I have, the Bauls of Bengal, because that's one thing the Bauls have really contributed to Indian spirituality. This freewheeling, rambling sort of individualist spirituality, an eccentricity that says, tradition is what it is, but I'm going to follow my heart. I'm going to do what feels right to me. And it's not going to be independent. It's not going to be in a vacuum outside of all these traditions. It's going to be articulated within the context of all the traditions. But I am going to make my own meaning out of all of that. And more importantly, I will publicly perform it. That's the thing about the Bauls. They were rejected in almost every context because they were such eccentric people. But they would wander. They would go from place to place and they would sing their songs. You know, ramble on. On that note, there's a line in a Red Hot Chili Pepper song that I really love. It really hit when I was a kid listening to that record. It's on the Californication record. What's the song called? I Like Dirt, I think. Or is it Purple Stain? Either, I think it's Purple Stain. But there's a song on that record that goes like, knock on wood, we all stay good, because we all live in Hollywood. And that's an important point, because this is a melting pot. I love living in Hollywood. It's a crazy place. And very few people who live here are from here. Like myself, we all moved here for one reason or another. And so everyone here, arguably, especially in my part of town, has this sort of dreamer energy, idealistic energy, as it were. So this is a very crazy town. I love it because of how multicultural it is. I love New York. I love Los Angeles. I love Kuala Lumpur. I love Hong Kong. I love cities, Kolkata, Delhi, because they're just so diverse and they're so crazy and so hectic. So you're very rarely going to find me outside of a city. I seek out the liminality that the city offers because of the just sheer mass of human beings. Some people love nature. You know, they go out to where there are mountains. I love nature too, but I love human nature much more. Nothing excites me more than a human being. A tree is beautiful, a mountain is beautiful, a sky is beautiful, but nothing for me could compare to the eternity and infinity contained within a human mind that I encounter on the street. For example, today outside of the Taco Bell, I explored an entire universe with my friend. You know, it was wonderful. He was telling me how he broke his arm, so he had to sell all of his old guitars, and all he had with him now is his Gresht Firebird, and he's got his amp and his guitar, and he just stays outside with these two things. And we were in the Taco Bell, and he's telling me all his ideas, and we're swapping rock and roll stories and things like that. And then I was like, wow, this is so cool, because I'm in his mind right now, exploring his world and his history, and that to me is so fascinating. You know, I love cities for that reason. But that's why I love that line, knock on wood, we all stay good, because we all live in Hollywood. How can we stay good? If there's something called good, if there's something called morally right, come and live in Hollywood for a year or two and you'll see, you'll quickly forget that idea. It's like in the Guns N' Roses song. You know where you are? You're in the jungle, baby. You gonna die. What a lyric. It'll bring you to your knees. Sha-na-na-na-na-na-na-knee. Right? Like what Axl does is he gets on a bus. Axl Rose. Where is he from? Kentucky? Iowa? I don't know, I forget. But Axl Rose, right? He's from a small town in a cornfield somewhere, right? Which is wonderful. But then he gets on a bus and moves to Los Angeles, seeking opportunities. Just like a Baul might move out of Northeast India or Northwest India into Europe. For one reason or another, this guy gets on a bus and moves to Hollywood, to Los Angeles. Now, in the story, he gets off the bus and an unhoused person walks up to him like the incarnation of Hollywood. You know, the incarnation of, I would say the avatar of Hollywood is the drunk, like rambling schizophrenic on the corner of Hollywood and Vine. The prophet of LA. They have so much to say. And so he comes up to Axl, who just fresh off the bus, right? And this guy comes up and he says, do you know where you are? You're in the jungle, baby. You're gonna die. Oh, I love a jungle, but nothing is wilder than a jungle of humans. Man is a wolf to man, so jungles don't impress me anymore. It's the jungle of humanity in which I find my mother Kali. That's the wildness and madness and solitude that I seek. When I'm in the jungle, I'm surrounded by friends. When I'm in the jungle of humanity, it's far more dangerous. And how much more exciting. Yeah, so Hollywood, the holy wood, Vrindavana, the holy wood. So when Axl gets off the bus, the guy says to him, you know where you are? You're in the jungle, baby. You're gonna die. And then the riff comes in. It's so powerful. And the whole song, Welcome to the Jungle, is this like introduction to not just Los Angeles, but to what it's like to be in a city. And now, that's why I love that line, knock on wood, we all stay good because we all live in Hollywood. It's very hard to follow your idea of what's good when you're confronted with so many different ideas of the good. Different moralities, different meanings of life, different theologies. And then your theology is challenged, questioned, and maybe updated. To be open to that is a wonderful thing. Cities are very difficult for, I think, people who insist upon a particular way of life, because that way of life in the context of the city is always going to be called out and questioned and threatened and challenged. You know, so you get, and so the knock on wood, we all stay good because we all live in Hollywood. With Dracula and Dollar Good. Well, okay, I forget the next line. Then he goes, way out there, but I don't care because this is what I want to wear. What a great line. It's like the movement, the punk rock movement, arguably. That's what he's referring to. He's like saying, like, I don't care, like, this is weird. Like, I want to wear it. And so, though it's way out there, I don't care, this is what I want to wear. So that public act is an act of defiance. To go out with a different hairstyle, or with piercings, or with tattoos, or like not any piercings or tattoos in a world where there are many piercings or tattoos. To go out with like clothes that just aren't like anybody else's clothes. You're wearing them because you want to wear them. And it's okay if it's what everyone else is wearing. If you want to wear it, that's the only thing that matters. It's not about being eccentric for being eccentric. It's eccentricism is not for eccentricism's sake. It's for following the call of the heart, which is inherently individualistic and eccentric. Because like there is no redundancy in the Sanskrit language, there is no redundancy in the universe. So every human being is here uniquely to express something that no other human being can express. So that means if you're here, you have something to do that naturally you won't find any models for because it hasn't been done yet. Though you can, of course, benefit from looking at what's already there and then articulating something new in the context of that. But it will always be something new, and it will contribute insofar as it's a public act, and no act is not a public act. Insofar as it's an act, it will contribute to the human story. And arguably, that is the entire metaphysic of Shaivism. Shiva eva grihitva pashubhavaha bhoktaeva bhogyam sada sarvatra samsitaha. Lord Shiva is established everywhere as every act of enjoyment. He's established as every enjoyer and every enjoyed object. He is that reality who takes on the form of a human being for no other reason than to delight himself, to play his game, krida, lila, story. For the sake of a story, he does all of this. So each and every one of us has a role to play. And notice, when King James, by the way, he can't be faulted because he's doing what he feels like he should do. Again, you can't have a problem with King James translating the word pharmakia as witch, even though it's led to such consequences, because he did it based on what he wanted to do. So is he contemptible? No one is contemptible insofar as they are truly and honestly living out what they want to do. So if you want to talk about adharma, and I don't like to talk about adharma, but if there is such a thing as adharma, it's just dishonesty. It's just not willing to do what you want to do. Because it's hard to say whether what you want to do is good or bad. Because often things that appear bad at first ultimately seem good. And a lot of things that appear good ultimately seem bad. You don't really know, but you just know how you feel. So the Shakta view is what moves you, allow yourself to be moved by it in whatever direction it takes you. As Rumi, Coleman Barks translates Rumi as having said, allow yourself to be drawn by the strange pull of that which you love. It could be a person, just like texting them, or it could be a place, just visiting that place, or it could be a dream, or it could be a piece of music, or a book on the bookshelf or in the library or something, just allowing yourself to be drawn by it for no other reason than because it intrigues you. It almost always begins with intrigue or interest. Imagine somebody walking into Paris and they see a bohemian camp outside Paris by the road. And there's a fire, and they're singing songs in a language this person doesn't understand. He feels intrigued. What will he do? Will he continue to go back to the city and go back to his house and live the life that he's always lived? Or will he allow himself to be drawn by the strange pull of that which he finds fascinating? And if he does that, he might be exposed to a wholly new world, and he might come back a musician unlike any other musician in his town, able to integrate what he learned there with what he already learned as a violinist in Western European contexts. How beautiful to think that our only responsibility is to follow our heart. So the Baul tradition is important for that reason. And it brings fresh energy into Europe and vice versa. So we look at Ramakrishna or Vivekananda or even Holy Mother. Notice all three of them are like iconoclastic. They're individuals, each in their own right, because they're so revolutionary. Sometimes in ways that are too subtle to even understand unless you have a background in Indian philosophy and Indian spirituality. Like some of the things that Vivekananda suggests, some of the things that Ramakrishna suggests are so out there, way out there, but they don't care because that's what they wanted to wear. So I wanted to have this discussion with you all about innovation, about eccentricity, about individuality, about the desire to follow the restless heart, even when it takes you out of the stream of tradition. Because again, one thing that India does really well, in fact, one thing that India does best, is preserve its traditions. And thank God, because if it didn't, then we wouldn't, again, have any basis for our individuality, do you see? If we didn't have contexts, like traditions, conventions, then what would we base our thinking off of? What would we innovate upon if there was nothing to build off of? Like, the thing about India that is so unique and so remarkable, and unlike so many places in the world where for political reasons and for historical reasons, cultures are destroyed and texts are burned and traditions are lost, India has maintained its texts, its traditions, and its cultures, despite 700 years of Mughal rule, despite the British invasion, despite the wave of Buddhism that came and went in India. Nothing could really shake our Vedas. That's remarkable, isn't it? And most of these weren't even written down. Because when you write books down and put them in a library, some barbarian army will come and ransack your library and burn it down. When the Mongols invaded, they burnt down Nalanda University, and that place allegedly burnt for, some say 3 days, some say 3 weeks, some say 3 months. I don't know what the time scale was. Indians are also prone to exaggerate. But it's important to remember that it burnt for a long time because there were so many books there. Imagine how many scriptures we lost after Nalanda was razed to the ground. It didn't matter to us though, because we still kept our traditions, and here we are chanting the same Vedas, the same Trambakam Yajamahe, the same Ganana Antva Ganapate Gomavamahe, the same hymns, the same verses. They're all chanted and lived and practiced. No other culture has managed to maintain, arguably, a 9,000 years, by conservative estimate, living tradition. Like our Vedic fire is still being lit and still being worshipped in the exact same way, more or less, using the same mantras, more or less, as we used way back when, in like 3,800 BC. That's remarkable. So there's something to be said about that too. Although I tend to lean nowadays more and more towards the innovation-eccentric individualism direction, I used to way more lean on the more conservative aspect of like trying to maintain the traditions as they are presented in the text. And arguably it's both. It's the tension between both that enlivens our tradition. So there's something to be said about conservatism. And Indians are remarkably conservative in one way. And by India, again, I have to clarify again and again, I don't mean the political nation called India as it exists right now. I mean the Indic civilization, which would include places that today would be called Pakistan and Bangladesh, places that would be called Tibet or Nepal. These are all part of the Indic civilization, Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, maybe even parts of Central Asia, I don't know. But put all of this together, and I would even include Coptic Egypt there, because much of northern Egypt was also influenced by Buddhism. But put all of that together, you get the Indian civilization, the Indic civilization. And the one thing this civilization has done really well is keep records. And they weren't necessarily written records. Those, again, can be burnt and destroyed. The secret to Indian civilization is a strong memory and a deep reverence for those texts which are memorized. So when I was growing up, again, I told you, I wasn't invited to think about the text that I was memorizing. I was only told to memorize them. And I would be very upset about this. I would expect to be told what the text mean before memorizing them, and it was always insisted upon that I just memorize them. So I would sit there and for endless hours just commit these things to memory. But now I realize the wisdom of that. It was enough for my grandfather and for many people in my family to just memorize this shit without ever once asking what it meant. My grandfather was interesting in that way because he was more of a thinker than I think many people in our lineage. But arguably so many Indians, they just do what they are told to do without ever thinking about what it means. And that's why if you ask most Panditjis, if you ask most people in your cultural context, especially if you grew up Indian, why they bathe the Shiva Lingam or why they walk around the temple in this way or what this verse means, they'll probably like tell you not to ask such questions. So they might even get upset that you're asking them at all. They don't know. And they don't think that they ought to know. They don't care to know because their cultural responsibility is first and foremost to preserve. Right? And thank God for that. Thank God for that, because it means we now have traditions that we would otherwise have lost if there wasn't this great reverence for tradition. So I just want to point out this paradox. Obedience, that's the thing. Obedience is so important. And maybe it's more important in a particular stage of spiritual life. Like in the beginning, maybe we have to be obedient and just download as much as we can. Because if we resist in the beginning, notice we're closing ourselves off of the contexts or the building blocks which we can later use to articulate our own individual position or our own approach to spiritual life. The Bauls, in this way, had it easy because they were just surrounded by so much spirituality, so they could be individualists within that context. We who are not in the Baul context of Northeast India, we're not in Kolkata exposed to all of that, unless we're on the internet and actively searching, we have to be careful here, because when somebody is giving us a tradition, we should try to accept it in the way that it's given. And not in the beginning try to take it apart and make it our own. Because then we're actually dismantling the very thing that we can later build off of. So we should just accept the building. Do you see the logic here? It's like if you want to be an individual, then you better wholeheartedly accept the views and systems of others without interpolating along your own lines, without interjecting too much in the beginning. Once you're sure that you have the system down as it's presented in its original form, then you can start to think about what it means to you. And so it's a remarkable thing that we've somehow managed to maintain traditions as they are. That's why I think sometimes when people are interacting with my content, it can be a bit confusing because at times I'm not prescribing, I'm just describing. In fact, I think I only ever describe. Very rarely do I prescribe. Because again, my only duty, I feel, is to share maximally all those things that have been shared with me to the best of my ability in the way that they were shared. Like if I talk about Shankara, I should talk about Shankara. Or if I talk about Ramanuja, I should try to present Ramanuja to the best of my ability. And then, insofar as I'm going to offer my own ideas, obviously you'll never be able to like reproduce verbatim what someone else said, even if you have the text in front of you. Again, it's not prescriptive. It's just interpretive. I'm interpreting along the lines of my own practice and experience the traditions that I'm trying to present to the best of my ability in the original form. They're describing the various traditions of India. So when people come to the lectures and I'm talking Ramanuja, they think I'm saying this is what I believe or this is what I do. It's not. But in some ways, I'm very influenced by Ramanuja. For crying out loud, I was born on the same day as him, right? We have the same tithi. So I love Ramanuja, but there are many ways in which I don't subscribe to Ramanuja's philosophy. So too with Shankara. I love Shankara and have taught Shankara. And I've practiced so much of that. But it's not my philosophy, not the one I grew up with, and not the one I'm interested in teaching. And even my philosophy is not necessarily that which is presented in the text, which I like to represent as closest to my philosophy. Because my philosophy is only mine and never yours, you see. Because it's my unique interpretation. So all we can do together now is discuss these various ideas. And that's just what I mean to do. I want to present Shankara, Ramanuja, I want to present Madhava, I want to present all these great masters. And I want to say, this is most important for today's lecture, that they were all revolutionaries. They were, each and every one of them, so unique. And they were building off of something that came before, but they added something new. And that's what last week's discussion was all about. I was talking about stories where the guru and the disciple disagree. Do you know? And these are important stories because you'll see that some of the controversy on the internet surrounding the work that we do has to do with authenticity, lineage, credibility, legitimacy. And that's an important discussion, actually, because if there weren't more conservative elements in the community that are calling out idiosyncratic and individual iconoclastic actors, that would maybe dismantle the structures that we're building off of. But at the same time, if there weren't innovators, if there weren't interpreters who are willing to take things in a different direction, the whole thing would be stagnant and stale. So having said all of that, we now come to the fundamental tension that I want to point you to in this lecture. And it's the tension of tradition on one end, conservatism and preservation on one end, and innovation on the other. Spontaneity, inspiration, the willingness to follow your own heart. This is the spectrum. The poles of the spectrum are tradition and innovation. And all of these voices that I mentioned earlier, Madhava, before him Ramanuja, before him Shankara, and then you can add to this like Nimbarka, Bhaskara, you can add to this Chaitanya, of course, you can add to this Ramakrishna, you can add to these all these great voices that have shaped the way that we look at the Vedas and shaped the way that we understand what the Vedas reveal. And more importantly, I would say for us, the Agamas and the Tantras, they too reference the Vedas, but they might be considered a separate stream. Even within the Tantras can be very revolutionary. They might say things that the Vedas don't say, but they will quickly say that this is what the Vedas actually said. That's one way in which you see them reconciling these two things. They're presenting something new and they're saying, no, it's not new. It's just what the Vedas meant. We're just making explicit what was implicit. But the Vedas never said that. We say that. But we're saying we're not saying something new. We're saying what was really there. We're just interpreting it and bringing it out. We're making it more clear. But it was there all along. So this is the way that many Indian masters, and again by Indian I mean the civilization, they reconcile this paradox between tradition and spontaneity. So they'll just say, like, straight up, they'll be like, yeah, if something is new and idiosyncratic, it ought to be rejected. And right after that, they'll present something new. But then very quickly, upon presenting something new, the master in question will then justify how it's not new. Notice Abhinavagupta is very important in the beginning of the Tantra Loka. You know what he says? And by the way, I should make this very clear. The Tantra Loka is an exegetical work. Its job is to comment upon the tantric texts that are in circulation at that time. So the tantric texts themselves are considered primary sources, the direct revelation of Lord Shiva. Abhinavagupta's role as an acharya or as a teacher is to interpret those texts, in some ways to present them in a way that's like digestible by his audience, and compile them and edit them. And so what he does in the beginning of his Tantra Loka, his magnum opus, 6,000 or so verses of commentary and padati, ritual instructions, he says, there is nothing that I've said here in the Tantra Loka that is original. Do you see? It's a very important disclaimer. Because if these were his own ideas, if he just came out and said, oh, this is my new thing. This is the Abhinavagupta method. Do you know? Like now it's very fashionable to say, oh, it's this person's name. Like it's the, I don't know, Jim Baldwin method. So I just made up a name. It might be the actual person name. No, it's a coincidence if there's a Jim Baldwin here. But like just a random person, like a Wim Hof method or something. Like it's not important anymore for Wimji to like reference the Tumo traditions of Tibet or anything. Like if the method works, it's enough to be sold and presented and shared. And it must be patented. It's my method, and therefore I put my name on it so I can uniquely sell it. Yeah, I'm sure the Jim Baldwin method works. And that's all that matters. Does it work or not? And therefore, it makes sense to patent it, to put your name on it, like Bikram Yoga. It doesn't matter whether or not those sequences existed in the Ashtanga tradition before him. If Bikramji puts his name on it, that means he can have a brand around it or can trademark it or something like that. Right? So the name is somewhat modern. It's a consumer capitalist response to commercializing certain things, which again, I'm not condemning. I'm just saying is historical fact of our time. But back then, culturally speaking, if something was new, if it was like a person's method, if it was your own individual approach, like Alexander method or something like that, it's immediately rejected because it's just like idiosyncratic. It might have worked for that guy, but it doesn't mean it's going to work for me. And so just because Wim Hof method works for Wim Hof doesn't mean it's going to work for me. And even if it does work for me in the beginning, that might be a superficial result. Long term, it might not. What is he going off of? If it's just something that he made up on the spot out of his own idiosyncratic anecdote experience, then there isn't corroboration there. There isn't the time-tested, corroborated verification that you get from something like scripture. When something is done by lots of people over a long span of time and it's proven to work, then that thing is way more reliable than something that has been proven to work in the last 10 years that only one guy has successfully done and maybe his 10 or 12 students. You know what I mean? Like, if you look at that guy and you're like, I want to be like that guy, I better do his method, so I'll pay thousands of dollars to go to the workshop. That's good and all. It worked for him. No one can deny that. But will it work for you? And the question is, why would I pay $2,000 to go to a workshop to learn something that worked for one guy when I could instead go and learn something that's worked for many, many, many people across many, many, many years or many, many centuries even? So if something is new in the Indic cultural context, it is often immediately rejected as being idiosyncratic, anecdotal, and unverified or untested. Maybe in thousands of years, if many people do it, then we'll take it seriously. But then again, even then we can't take it seriously because its foundation was still the rambling of some person. So the point here then is the Vedas are considered authentic and legit because they, more importantly, weren't revealed by a person with all the idiosyncrasies and flaws that people have. You know, it's not a person that reveals the Vedas. And I'll come to this later, why the Vedas are so authoritative. But it's important now to just say that if something is real and true and good, you must be able to point to the Vedas and say, see, it was there. And therefore it has, it's based, right? Like as we would say today, it's legit, it's credible, it's based. Okay. If Abhinavagupta, when he composes his Tantra Loka, comes out and says, this is my new idea, I came up with this, you can reject the text on that basis. You could say, okay, yeah, then I shouldn't read it. So instead what he says is, nothing that I have said in this text is original. Thank God he said that, because now we have to ask, okay, if it's not original, where'd you get it from? And he will say, every single thing that I say in this text can be found in the Tantra called Malini Vijaya Uttara Tantra. It's important to note that Abhinavagupta quotes a range of different tantric texts. And by the way, these masters, like Abhinavagupta and Kshema Raja and Yoga Raja, you'll see that they're not just quoting tantras or agamas. They quote the Upanishads, they quote the Bhagavad Gita, because those are, of course, the most important authorities in that time and also in this time. So they're versed in these things. They're based. And when they give views, they almost always back those views up with an appeal to scripture. Now, Abhinava appeals to a range of different texts in the Tantric tradition. Some of them are like not available anymore. Some of them are very niche texts. And by the way, he seems to be quoting from memory. That's what's really interesting. It's almost like he's learned these texts and memorized them and he just has a database of all these different tantric works, and he's pulling from them liberally as he gives his commentary. But importantly, it's a commentary on an existing text. And he says, in the beginning of Tantra Loka, that it's a commentary on the Malini Vijaya Uttara Tantra. Why is this important? It's actually very, very important. Because a Tantra, Let's come now to a conversation about genre and a conversation about authenticity and validity and legitness or not legitimacy. Yes, that's the word I'm looking for. We gave a lecture about 2 or 3 weeks ago around Shiva Ratri time, I think, called What is Tantra? Or what do we mean by Tantra? And I put the word Tantra in like brackets because if we don't have this conversation, we might all be using the same word but implying different things. It's somewhat sad to me that I have a playlist. It's called The Tantric Guru. And there are at least 20 videos in there, right? I don't know, I can go check right now, but I don't need to. But there are at least 20 something videos in there. Now, in each and every one of these videos, again and again, I offer the disclaimer that only God is the guru. No human being can be a guru. Again and again, I try to clarify Ramakrishna's position on the Guru. And I try to clarify our views on the Guru based on Ramakrishna's views, based on the Guru Gita, which tells us, Brahmanandam paramasukadam kevalam jnanamurtim dvandvatitam gaganadadisham tattvamasya adilaksham. Even when I've given you a mantra, I have immediately quoted those passages from the Bhagavad Gita. I've quoted the Dakshina Murti Stotram, right? Like very quickly, after the mantra, I give you a whole like thing. And immediately I'm telling you, I am not giving you a mantra. God, like it's between you and God. Like no human interpreter can play the role of guru because God alone is the guru. That's the disclaimer. But it's hard, I think, in a modern context influenced by 70s guru culture and cults of personality to really get that. It's almost as if everything I've ever said about the guru has fallen on deaf ears in so many cases. And the recent controversies on the internet point to the fact that very few of these people have read or watched those lectures, read materials, or watch those lectures because they're there over the course of years. Since 2020, way before I gave any mantras to anybody, like since 2020, I was expressing our view on the Guru, and the Guru is a tattva, not a person. No human can be a Guru, and that has meant that we can be very casual and relaxed with one another. You know, because I don't see anybody as a student, and arguably we're all just like crazy, mad lovers of God, hanging out together, enjoying something together. God. And we're all learning from God. Love, who are partial to none. We are all equal before thy sight. So now here comes the double-edged sword. In one case, I am teaching, I am sharing views, and I'm speaking as an authority on these views. Partly because I spent my life studying these things, and so therefore that gives a certain like credibility or like authority maybe. Secondly, because of Sanskrit fluency, that gives a sort of interpreter's privilege maybe. And thirdly, because of just the factor of a commanding and magnetic personality. These three things together mean it's very easy then to put me on a pedestal and say, this is my leader and authority and teacher. So this person must tell me what to do. Because they're putting themselves in a position to do that. They're an acharya, a teacher. And, you know, you could say, oh, they've got this purva abhishekam. You can point to a time when I was dunked in oil and you could say, there you go. That was his consecration in the Shaiva Siddhanta context, which now gives him the authority, quote unquote, to teach. And therefore he is an authority, a teacher, an acharya. And as an authority, his job is to tell me what to think about the texts that he's presenting. Of course, I'm going to select what texts I'm going to present to you. So already there is a bit of a translators or interpreters or acharyas bias, you could say, right? Because I'm going to present to you the texts that I think are valuable for our community, and a lot of times it's just going to be the text that I'm inspired to teach, the text that I like. So that's the second thing. I'm going to present texts, but I ideally should not tell you what to think about them, although I will try to comment and do exegesis and offer a few views. But then the third thing is, what do you do in your spiritual life? Now it becomes my role to tell you what to do, but I can't tell you what to do. I don't know what you should do. But the books do tell us what to do. That's the exciting thing. You know, so a lot of times when you're asking questions, you're asking me questions, I'm not going to have answers for you. And I hope that I don't, unless I can point to a text, or I don't want to just like say like, oh, this is what you should do, or that's what you do, what Kali tells you to do in your heart. So the double-edged sword is this. On one hand, I've put myself in a position where I appear to be an authority. And I'll say, this is what this Sanskrit word means, or this is what this text is. And you'll take my word for it. And more importantly, if I prescribe a practice, if I say, here's a mantra, now do a purasharana, this is the way that the text enjoins the purasharana ought to be done. So, okay, now this person is telling me what to think and what to do. The flip side of this is I actually have no interest in doing that. Like, if you try to have a more mentor-like relationship with me, you'll be very disappointed and very frustrated because I'm just a person. I'm just a human being like you. And there's like literally nothing that makes me different from you. Right? Like we're all equal in the sense that we're all fucked up human beings. Like what? Like God alone is perfect. And given all the stuff that I said earlier, it would be manifestly against my religion to tell you what to think and what to do. I'm Shiva. And so are you. You're a Gana. And as Ganas, we're mad and wild and free to express ourselves however we want. If I were to tell you what to do, the danger here is that you'll take me seriously. Because, again, it's very easy to put me in a position of authority because of knowledge or because of experience or because of Sanskrit fluency or because of, I don't know, because of any reason or because of a lack of wanting to take responsibility. You say, somebody must be responsible for me. The problem is I'm not and I won't be, because God alone is the guru. And so the double-edged sword here is that if people want me to be an authority, I won't be. And they'll be disappointed about that. And if they don't want me to be an authority, I will be, because it's easy to put me in that position. It's easy to put any human being in that position. And the big problem here is that we human beings, with all of our frailties, like to be in that position. So I have to be really careful here to constantly present these disclaimers to prevent those projections and to prevent any subconscious urge to step into them, to assume the role of a cultural or spiritual authority. You know, God forbid I become an authority. Can you imagine? I have lived my whole life in the context of anti-authoritarianism. I play in a rock band, for crying out loud. So the fact that I could be an authority on anything is manifestly problematic because I have an inherent problem with authority to begin with. So should you. Arguably, everyone here is an individual. And as individuals, we accept ourselves as the authority. But we're not closed, right? We're not dogmatic. We're not unwilling to listen to views. We're just not ready to accept those views as our own until they can be tried and tested in the theater of our own reason and experience. So then it's very important that there is this playlist on what is a guru. And you'll notice throughout that playlist, there is a constant emphasis on this idea that no human being can be a guru. But at the same time, we don't abandon the role of the acharya or the role of the mantra, diksha process. Like we don't abandon the upadesha diksha, the abhishayams. All of those structures are still maintained, but as a kind of leela, as a kind of sacred drama in which during that ceremony, Lord Shiva is represented by that specific person in the course of the ceremony, and then the mantra is given, all of that. But when the ceremony is over, it's like the actors take off their costume. That doesn't make the ceremony unreal though, because it's sacred drama, and it's often drama and art that presents more reality than our mundane life, you know. So it's like in that moment something real occurs. Lord Shiva might really give a mantra, but it doesn't mean the person who is playing the role of Lord Shiva as the acharya is actually Lord Shiva, because I mean they are, but they're not to be treated like that, because in the end of the day it's like we're humans. And that's wonderful actually. Lord Shiva playing the role of Jiva as one. No Jiva can be Shiva, but every Jiva is essentially Shiva. But Shiva is Shiva, you know. Shiva is the sum total of all Jivas. So Shiva alone is the guru. That's one thing that we've stressed throughout that playlist. But you'll notice throughout that playlist there's also a tension. And that's what I want to highlight and talk about today. The tension, notice, is not just in the lectures that you'll find in the what is a tantric, it's called the Tantric Guru, I think that's the name of the playlist. The tension is not just in that playlist, right? The tension is in the tradition as a whole. Because on one hand, we're saying no human can be a guru, and on the other hand, we have human beings who are not only giving lectures and commentaries on texts, but who are also presenting which texts to read and which texts not to read. Just by presenting certain texts, you've already made a decision to push away other texts. That's also like some kind of interpretation. But then more importantly, the person does lead in one way, shape, or form. That person does suggest and advise and guide. So then we have a tension here. Is that person a guru or not? That's the first tension. But the second tension is about lineage. To what extent is the person supposed to be aligned with the lineage? Because here we have the concept of ekavākyatā, and we talked about it on Thursday. Ekavākyatā means everybody in the lineage should say more or less what everyone else in the lineage said. This is called corroboration. If any individual steps out of that stream and says something that is not in keeping with the lineage, then they lose the credibility of the lineage. They're no longer now speaking from the lineage. They're speaking from their own ideas. And therefore, Abhinavagupta, when he composes the Tantra Loka, 6,000 or so verses on the Tantric tradition as a whole, he starts off by saying, I am not making something up. He doesn't have the authority to. He's a human being. And although we say he's Mantra Maheshwaracharya, we say he's Maha Maheshwaracharya Abhinavagupta. He's Abhinavagupta, the great teacher of Shaivism. He is like the Shankara of Shaivism. He is considered to be an avatara of Dakshinamurti, no less. Madhuraja, in his pen portrait on Abhinavagupta, claims that he's no less an avatara. And not just any avatara, an avatara of Shiva in his compassionate teacher form, which we know is the god of the Shaiva religion in the Shaiva Siddhanta sense. So Abhinavagupta is seen by some of his students to be a divine being, Shiva himself. What do you call it? Avatara, Karuna-avatara of Lord Shiva, Dakshinamurti himself. Shankara also was considered, maybe in one sense, to be like Dakshinamurti. The Dakshinamurti Stotram, composed by Adi Shankaracharya or attributed to Adi Shankaracharya, is, one might think, almost autobiographical. Because, in the beginning, Maunam Vyakyam, it says that there's a teacher who is young and his disciples are old. That's kind of interesting, right? Because that was Shankara's life. He was a young teacher and older disciples would gather around him. And in the Dakshinamurti Stotram, that portrait is offered of a young teacher sitting under a tree, teaching in silence. Maunam Vyakyam. So, whether it's Shankara, who is divinized to be an incarnation of Shiva, or Abhinavagupta, who is euhemerized as like Dakshinamurti himself, importantly, he himself wouldn't say that. Abhinavagupta is not going to open his text by saying, hear ye, repent for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. I am the incarnation of Lord Shiva, and I as the incarnation of Lord Shiva am now going to teach you Shaivism. He's never going to say that. He is an acharya. He's a human being, a brahmana, who is part of a lineage, actually he's part of several lineages, which is confusing when it comes to Abhinavagupta, who, as a result of his lineages, has learnt something, and as a result of his spiritual practice, has experienced something, and now using his knowledge and experience, he wants to interpret a text for the benefit of other people, or more importantly, for no other reason than because he wants to. You see, Manjushri is the tantric equivalent of Shiva in some context for the Buddhist, So in the case of Manjushri, she appears and as an emanation reveals things to people. So when Shantideva composed the Bodhyacharya Avatara, when he teaches it, he starts off by saying, I am not doing this to teach you guys. I myself have no authority to do that. Manjushri taught me this, and I am now going to tell you what she taught me because it's going to help me marinate my mind in those ideas that I like best. So often in the various lectures in the Tantric Guru series, I've tried to clarify that the reason I'm doing this is because it's fun. Do you know what I mean? It's like a Monday night on Zoom. It's free. You just hop onto the Zoom room, and then for like 5 or 6 or 9 hours or whatever, we just do this. And then I speak for 9 or 12 hours at times, and people say, okay, he must be on cocaine. Like, what? Like, is it so unconscionable that somebody could enjoy something so much that they want to do it for 9 hours straight? Like, must you be on stimulants? I mean, like, guys, like, have you done stimulants? Like, has anyone done them? Because you crash, right? Like cocaine has a crash. There's a spike and there's a crash. You know what I mean? Like, you have to, like, keep doing lines if you want. Like, if you're gonna do 9 or 12 hours straight, like, I'm gonna have to be, like, getting off camera to, like, do lines to come back on camera. And, like, but no, it's 9 or 12 hours of continuous lecturing, right? And that's important because, look, you could stay up 4 days in a row only for so long on stimulants. They're not that powerful, you know what I mean? Like, they can't do that much for you. And they're not a substitute for sheer raw enthusiasm. Do you know, like, if you love something so much, then you'll just want to do it. And in fact, you might want to do it all day. Do you know, once I did a 16-hour jamathon. Like, it was called a jamathon. What a stupid name. But the idea was we would play music for 16 hours straight, nonstop. And at no point would there be no music. Like, we went into a parking lot and we got the band together. And just so that we could fill the time, it was not just one band. It was a bunch of different bands. But the idea is that the music would never stop for 16 straight hours. What a crazy and weird thing to do. Just get a band together, go to a parking lot, and just play for 16 hours. But that's what we did. We just played for 16 hours straight. There was no Coke or Adderall or anything. We just loved music. And we were, like, down to just play together because that's what we would have been doing anyways, except we just invited people to come. So here, we give these long-ass lectures, 9 hours sometimes, 5 hours sometimes, 3 hours sometimes. But they're just in the context of talking about ideas that we love, like sharing. And here we are just together, talking about things that are cool to talk about. It's fun. It's inherently meaningful and enjoyable to do it. And it's inherent to me. Like, it's my swadharma because I would be doing it anyway. No matter what, whether there was a financial reward or consequence, there's usually a financial consequence. It's not profitable by any means. But even if it was, and even if it wasn't, it wouldn't change that I would be doing it. Yes, I like to do it. This is way out there, but I don't care because it's what I want to wear. It's like what I want to do. Like, I want to get on Zoom and for a few hours talk about the things that I love. Why? And Shantideva gives a really good reason. I like his reason a lot, which is to marinate my mind in those things that are inspiring as a way to learn them myself. I once asked Swami Sarvapriyanandaji this question, actually. And I asked him, is it okay to give lectures and teach and whatnot? He said, yes, it's a very blessed thing to do because then you'll learn it twice. You know, that was a beautiful way of saying it. It's like you learn twice, because what you learned once, you only really learn when you share. And that's, I think, something that the Course in Miracles also expressed, that you only get what you give. Oh, maybe that was a New Radical song. You only got what you give. And it's like, I don't really learn something until I've taught it, arguably. So you could say one reason for doing this is certainly not money. Oh God. If it was money, I should start charging. You know, that would be great. I think I should charge a drop-in fee or a ticket price for this. Then we can start maybe, I don't know, having a reason to do this. There's no reason to do this because it just costs time and energy and money. So then why do it? One reason could be this, because it's a way to learn. It's like a way to relearn what I thought I knew, and it's only when I share that then I learn it again. That's one reason. Second thing, you could say another reason to do this is because it's inherently meaningful and fun to marinate our minds on God. So in God. So if we sat down and tried to meditate for 3 hours or so, that would be great, but it might be kind of distracted. So instead of meditating for 3 hours, if we attend a lecture for 3 hours, that could be the equivalent. Because we're thinking about one thing for 3 hours straight. Those are 3 hours spent on thinking about God that otherwise could not have been spent thinking about God if we were meditating or not at the lecture. So satsang is helpful in that way. We can help each other think about one thing. But finally, the real reason I would argue that I do it is not really to learn. I think that's a great motive, and I think that's definitely part of it. But it's because it's just what I like. It's what I enjoy. I enjoy sharing those things that I love. And I think Abhinava, Shankara, Ramanuja, not that I'm equating myself with them at all. I just think that they did it for the same reason. That's just what they liked to do. Abhinava just liked to study. He liked to write. He liked to practice spirituality. He loved Tantra. He loved all the traditions around him. And by the way, he was just such a polymath, such a lover of learning that it wasn't just Tantra that he studied. He studied Buddhism, Jainism in both its tantric and non-tantric forms. He had grammar teachers. His father was his first Sanskrit teacher. But he had many other teachers for Sanskrit. But he also had teachers for drama. He composed a beautiful commentary on the Natya Shastra, right? Natya Shastra, sorry. It's called the Abhinava Bharati. And in that text, he gives us his Rasa Vada, the theory of aesthetic philosophy, which influences the spiritual idea, but is based on his spiritual realization, arguably. So he comments on the Gita, he comments on the Natya Shastra, he just loves whatever, and he will study Vaishnavism. He lists his influences, throughout the Tantra Loka, he offers biographical details. In the beginning, he tells you who his mother and father are. He tells you in what context he was born even. He goes so far as to tell you how his parents fucked. Literally first verse of the Tantra Loka, he tells you about his parents fucking. Isn't that crazy? And towards the end, he tells you about his Sadguru. There was one guru that maybe had more of an influence on him than any other guru. Although he had some 19 or so gurus, he lists many of them. There was one guru unlike any other. And it was Shambhunatha. To him, Shambhunatha was the main guru, his Mula guru, root teacher. Although he's had many gurus in his career, it was Shambhunatha, arguably, to whom he owed his highest spiritual revelation. And that's quite clear in his writing. But Bhuti Raja taught him some stuff. He learned some stuff from Lakshmana Gupta, who was Utpala Deva's disciple. That traces back to Somananda. So Abhinava Gupta, he's inheriting the Pratyabhigya lineage from his guru Lakshmana Gupta. He's inheriting the Krama lineage, arguably from one Bhuti Raja. And he's inheriting the Kaula Trika from Shambhunatha. And so he's taking these various traditions and putting them all together and creating something new. Nobody can deny that what Abhinava Gupta contributes to the tantric world is innovative. It's new. And we call it the Kaula Trika synthesis, because what he does is he takes the Trika, which is a living tradition in India. It's called the Purvamnaya, and it's very popular in Maharashtra at that time. But in Kashmir, he learns the Trika. Specifically, he learns the Kaula Trika, and then he uses that to interpret the Krama and to interpret the Pratyabhigya. So taking Krama plus Pratyabhigya plus Trika, he gives the whole thing a synthesis. He takes three and makes it into one. And therefore, he unites the various tantric communities that existed in India at that time, and it's a really beautiful thing, because you'll see in the Tantra Loka, although he says what I'm saying is not new. Nobody can deny that Tantra Loka is a masterpiece of innovation. It's an interpretive move that no one else in the world has ever done. And I'll give you one example. He uses the word Kali in the Tantra Loka. Okay, it's very important to point out that nowhere in the Malini Vijaya Uttara Tantra does the name Kali appear. So check this out, right? Abhinava says, nothing that I've said is original. Everything that I've said can be found in the Malini Vijaya Uttara Tantra. But there's no Kali in the Malini Vijaya Uttara Tantra. And yet he claims that there is. How is he able to do this? He points to another text, the Jayadratta Yamala Tantra, or the Tantra Raja Bhattarika. There, it's a Krama kind of teaching where the central deity is Kali. And then he says, the Kali that appears in that Tantra is none other than the Matra Sadbhava that appears in the Malini Tantra. And then he equates them. But the moment he equates Matra Sadbhava, the central deity of the Malini Vijaya Uttara Tantra, with Kali, the central deity of the Krama system, what he's done is he's fused together two traditions that prior to this might have been seen as separate standalone traditions. What he's saying when he presents his text is that they're not separate, they're actually one, and I've seen that through my own knowledge, through my own study, but also through my own experience. And now I'm going to interpret based on that. I'm going to tell you that the Kali of this text is actually the Malini or the Matra Sadbhava of this text. Therefore, everything that I'm saying can be found in the Malini Vijaya Uttara Tantra. Do you see what he's doing here? He's presenting new ideas, but at no point is he going to claim them as his own. Because to do so would be to invalidate him. He is a Maha Maheshwaracharya, seen as no less than an incarnation of Dakshinamurti Shiva. And yet he did not feel like he had the authority to offer his own ideas. Isn't that beautiful? And yet that's precisely what he did. Right? He offered his own ideas, but always with this deep reverential reference to a text. One text, actually. Although, like I said earlier, he quotes from so many different sources, a plethora of different tantric texts. It's one text in particular that he loves the most, that he feels is the most important tantra, and that is the Malini Vijaya Uttara Tantra. He does say that his system is called the Anuttara Trika, but at no point does he say the Anuttara Trika is a new system. Rather, it's that which is implied by all the various tantras. It's made explicit in his work, but it was always there. And he was the only one to maybe like take such a vast view of the tantras, and thereby he's the only one who was able to present it. But what he's presenting, he claims, is there in the text. This is important because the Malini Vijaya Uttara Tantra is not attributed to a human. It's attributed to Shiva. So coming back to the Vedas now, and coming back to the tantras, the Vedas claim no authorship. No human composed the Vedas, and no God either. Reality itself is the Vedas are reality. The Vedas are the, how do you put it? Like, I'll put it this way. They inhere in reality. Like, the very basic structure of the universe is the Veda. No human wrote it. It cannot be written. It is revealed, it is discovered, but it always inheres in reality. So the rishis of the Vedas are anonymous many of the times because they don't feel like they're the ones who did it. They just revealed it because it was revealed to them. By who? But perhaps by reality itself. Similarly, Shiva can be understood to be like that reality. Not a particular deity, but reality itself. And what is deity but a reading on reality? So that reality, which reveals the Vedas, reveals the Tantras or the Agamas. But it's Shruti, exactly. So Tantras and Agamas, like the Vedas, are considered Shruti. That's actually a very important word because Shruti means to be heard. The rishis heard the Vedas and not from anyone in particular. They just listen to reality, and the Vedas just constitute the song that reality sings eternally all the time, available to everyone who has the ears to hear it. So let he who hath ears hear. The rishis had ears, they heard, and they, because they felt like it, because it was their nature to do so, it was part of the Leela, they shared what they heard. And that's what we call the written and spoken and oral transmission called the Vedas. So despite the Mughal invasion, despite the British invasion, despite Buddhism, like no one was able to destroy the Vedas. Because they're indestructible. They inhere in reality. And what we can do now is we can point to the Buddha and say, he was teaching the Upanishads. The Buddha was not teaching anything new, although it seemed very new at the time. We can point to Shankara and Ramanuja and say, look, they're basing all their teachings on the Vedas. Although they both say different things, they're quoting the same shared scripture. Both will quote from the Gita or the Brahma Sutra or the Vedas, both the Vedas and the Upanishads in its karma and jnana kandas. Like you'll see that Madhava, Chaitanya, these are all very different schools of philosophy, but they all quote the same shared literature, like we were saying last week on Thursday. That's why it'd be good to watch that lecture also. I haven't uploaded it yet, but by the time I uploaded this one, upload this one, that should be out. So these two lectures kind of form a pair. That lecture on Thursday introduces you to some complexities. I ask, I think, 7 or 8 questions in that lecture that should actually be very important questions for you to consider, especially with regard to the Ramakrishna Vivekananda lineage, which is unlike any other lineage. And that it's very hard to understand what ekavākyatā looks like in this context, when the Guru seems to be representing all the lineages in the world. He's Sarvadeva Devi, but he's also Dharma Sthapana. He establishes all dharmas. Why should you exclude Vamacāra or Kolamara from that? How can you say that Sri Ramakrishna didn't teach Sri Vidya? How can you say he didn't teach Kolamara or Vamacāra? Can I point something out? I think this is very important, and it's very dangerous to make a claim as to what Sri Ramakrishna did or did not teach. Because wait a minute, all we have access to really is the Kathamrita, which is only M's account when he was there, often only on weekends. Remember, it is a known fact that Sri Ramakrishna taught many things to his disciples, just like Jesus taught many things to his inner circle, that was not made public or not revealed to other people. We know for a fact, because of Swami Saradananda's Leela Prasanga, that Sri Ramakrishna practiced Kolamara, Vamachara. We know that he did all those left-hand path techniques. In fact, there was very few things that he didn't do. He did pretty much everything. Hatha Yoga also. We forget this, but he had a Hatha Yoga guru. And remember, he almost died. He practiced Hatha Yoga, and then he spat out this black liquid, which could have been the Amrita, honestly. And the Hatha Yoga guru, who was teaching him this stuff, or some other guru, I think, it might not have been the guru, but some other sadhu said, thank God you spat it out. You're lucky, because it could have gone out through the crown of your head and you would have lost your body. Don't forget, Sri Ramakrishna almost died practicing Hatha Yoga. He practiced it though. And when it comes to Tantra, there's no Tantra that arguably he did not get excited about and did not want to practice. In that way, he's sort of like a universal man, an everyman. He represents all of our various dispositions and acted them all out for us, arguably, to see that they're all valid. And so I don't think anybody will deny that he practiced Kolamara or Vamachara. But I think many people will deny that he taught those things. Based on what do you deny that he taught those things? It's very important. I want to push back a little bit on this claim that Sri Ramakrishna, first of all, never taught Sri Vidya. That's very strange, because didn't he worship Holy Mother as Shodashi? Shodashi is the central deity of Sri Vidya, the goddess Shri. And Sri Ramakrishna learns Tantric Puja in the Bengali context, but arguably he would have had access perhaps to padhatis, ritual manuals, perhaps from South India or perhaps from Bengal itself, that detail the worship of Shodashi. I myself have in my collection Bengali padhatis that have this puja. So if people want to ask, is there Sri Vidya in Sri Ramakrishna, I can point you to Bengali Tantric manuals in which Sri Vidya materials appear. So before you accuse Sri Ramakrishna of not having any Sri Vidya, perhaps you should first learn some Sri Vidya. And what I mean by that is study the Bhavana Upanishad first. Study Kama Kala Vilasa, very important. Study Nitya Shodha Shikarnava, as otherwise known as the Vamakeshvari Tantra. If you have not studied any one of these tantras, and if you have yourself never looked at a Bengali primary tantric source, quickly you will come to say that there's no Sri Vidya. But there is really no tantra without Sri Vidya. I have to say, like, so much of the Shakta world is influenced by Sri Vidya. You know, and I just want to be clear about it, because I've studied these texts, and I will cite my sources and point you to the text. I will point you to the verses where those things appear. I'll give you a mantra right now, not in that sense, but I'll point you to a mantra and point you to where you can find it in the Kama Kala Vilasa. Im Paramaswamini Paramakasha Vahini Bhiksham Bhiksha Patram. Im Paramaswamini Paramakasha Vahini Surya Chandragni Bhiksham Patram Visha Swaha. Okay, that is a very important mantra. Look at this first bija, Im. Where do you get exegesis on Im, if not the Kama Kala Vilasa? In the Kama Kala Vilasa, a Hadi Vidya text in Sri Vidya, you learn about the bija mantra Im. When you see that bija mantra being applied here in the context of Kali, you'll see that what's happening here is that bija mantra, it's called the Kama bija mantra, is being applied here. And stuff like that, you'll see this Shravaya, Swaha. Like, you have to look at the padhatis. You have to look at Kaula Marga, Vamachara padhatis. And when you do that in context of the Nitya Shodha Shikarnava, immediately you will see the Sri Vidya. You can't deny it. But the reason why it's hard to see that is because, one, people don't read Sanskrit texts. They don't bother to learn Sanskrit, and then they don't bother to verify the sources. And I'm quoting those sources and inviting you to go look at those sources. But you won't be able to do it unless you, first of all, know Sanskrit, and second of all, want to. It's much easier to say, this guy is wrong about his claim that Sri Ramakrishna is teaching Sri Vidya. It's much easier to say that if you don't know any Sri Vidya and if you don't have any texts in front of you. We have texts in front of us. This is very important. When we do these lectures, especially on Thursdays and on Fridays, I will screen share the text with the Devanagari, with the transliteration, and with the translation. And most importantly, if you want, I give you the catalog number from the Mukta Bodha Institute where I got that text. Or I will show you from my personal collection. Or I will show you the OCR that I used. Or I will point you to, oftentimes, a public link that you yourself can click to see the text. Now, this is so important. Because we have the text in front of us, we can point to the text and say, this is the Sri Vidya influence. This mantra was seen in the Kama Kala Vilasa. Or this mantra appears in the Parati known as the Vamakeshvari Mata. Or the Yogini Hridaya. So if anybody thinks Sri Ramakrishna is not teaching Sri Vidya, here's my response. Two things. One, first learn Sri Vidya Baba. Start with that. Start with the Vamakeshvari Mata, the Nitya Shodha Shikarnava. Start with the Kama Kala Vilasa. Start with Yogini Hridaya. Just read the Yogini Hridaya. That's all. My only response to those who have a problem with my Sri Vidya claims is this. Just read the Yogini Hridaya and then come to Sri Ramakrishna. And you'll see very clearly that you can't even come to Bengali Tantra without admitting the Sri Vidya influence there. It's a very profound influence, actually. But then when you look at Sri Vidya, and this is very exciting, in the context of the Malini Vijayavtara Tantra. In other words, if you look at Dakshinamnaya in the context of Purvamnaya, you'll realize, oh my God, Abhinava Gupta was right. The tantric world is one. The reason is it's hard to make this claim is because we don't read Tantra Loka, Tantra Sara. We don't have access to those texts. If we did, I think we would appreciate this fact. The tantric world is one. It's wonderful. The entire tantric world is not like, okay, Sri Vidya in one corner, Kali in that corner, or like, God knows what else is going on in that corner. It's not like that. When you read the Tantra Loka, you see what is being called Matra Sadbhava in the Malini Vijayavtara Tantra is being called Kali in the Jayadratha Yamala Tantra or the Kali Kula texts. So Krama and Trika are really not two different systems. They're all rooted in one system called Shaivism. So when a Shaiva talks about Shaivism, perhaps it's in the context of Shaiva texts that present this unified view. So the first response I have to those who think that Sri Ramakrishna didn't teach Sri Vidya is this. Do we even know Sri Vidya enough to be able to say that? Can we actually say that we have enough of a grasp of those texts to be able to point at Sri Ramakrishna and say that's categorically not Sri Vidya? That's my first response. My second response. It is a well-known fact that Sri Ramakrishna worshipped Holy Mother as the goddess Shodashi. So I've given several lectures exploring this idea, like why? Why Shodashi? I think the best lecture for this would be the best tantric philosophy. In that lecture, we talk about some reason as to why Shodashi is the best reading of the absolute nature of reality as far as the Shakta tradition is concerned. Okay, so that's the second point. We know for a fact that Sri Ramakrishna worshipped Holy Mother as the goddess Shodashi, and more importantly, we have a padati for that. Because we know some of the mantras that he used. Swami Saradananda reports some of those mantras. So we can corroborate that with the various padatis that are available in Bengal at the time. Padati means ritual manual. So in those ritual manuals, you can quite clearly see that Sri Ramakrishna is performing some version of the Kaula Yaga. We don't really know what happened in that room. We don't know what that ritual is like, which was the point of my lecture, right? I was trying to say that we shouldn't just assume what happened in that room. We should inquire and reason out what happened. And so I pointed to some padatis, I made a few claims, etc. But we cannot deny, however you want to read this, that Sri Ramakrishna did worship his wife as Shodashi. That's the second point. The third point that I want to say in response is this. We know for a fact, based on what Swami Saradananda, a direct disciple, reports in the Leela Prasanga, we know for a fact that Sri Ramakrishna performed Vamachara and Kolamara practices. We also know that he dissuaded Swami Vivekananda in one conversation from doing those things. We also know that in another conversation, he scolded Swami Vivekananda for having a problem with those things. Don't you notice this? You can't say that Sri Ramakrishna is the representation of Sarva Dharma, all the various schools of Indian philosophy, and then say that he didn't represent Vamachara and Kaula unless you're willing to say that those aren't legit forms of spiritual practices. And I don't think Sri Ramakrishna would say that, being the case that he practiced those things. And not only did he practice those things, he verified that they worked. Now, a very mature student of Ramakrishna might make this claim. We don't know what he taught or what he didn't teach. But from what we know, maybe we can assume he didn't teach Kaula Marga. But if you have the humility to say we don't know what he taught and what he didn't teach, you should also have the humility to say we don't know that he spoke out against Vamachara or Kolamara in every way, shape, or form. Yes, it's not the narrative that Bellarmine champions, but Bellarmine does not have a monopoly on Ramakrishna. That's the sad fact. Like, even if Bellarmine does not give lineage authority to somebody, the fact of the matter is that Ramakrishna alone is the guru, and Ramakrishna teaches what Ramakrishna teaches to each and every individual. Hence, all the claims I was making at the beginning of the lecture, you can bring them back now and make this claim. It is very important that we also personalize and approach things according to our own understanding. So coming back to this now, there are many instances in which Swami Vivekananda is challenged by other disciples of Sri Ramakrishna. It is important to note that even the direct disciples of Sri Ramakrishna all had a different idea as to what their master taught them. And that's just how it should be. So referencing my Thursday night lecture, you can see there that when we talk about accountability in lineage, we must remember that it's a balance between tradition and spontaneity. If too much spontaneity, we lose that which we can build off of. Too much tradition and it becomes stagnant, and we subjugate or relegate what we want to do to what other people think that we ought to do. So the two are balanced together and they're in tension with one another. And often Indian history, if it shows you anything, is it shows you that it's incredibly tolerant and receptive to innovation. So when we read Ramakrishna or when we read the Tantras, first of all, we should read Ramakrishna, right? We should read the Lila Prasanga, we should read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, we should read all the available literature that there is on Sri Ramakrishna before making claims about Sri Ramakrishna and his lineage. But secondly, when we talk about Tantra, we should read, we should interact with the text. And if anything, that's your safeguard. That's your check and balance against institutions or individuals who have authority over you. Nobody has authority over you. You're a Bhairava, you're a Bhairavi, you're Shiva himself. And given that, the only way that you can be empowered in the tantric world, and I have a lecture called How to Stay Safe in Tantra dealing with this topic, is to learn and study for yourself. So being there with the text and looking at the text, that's what we base everything off of. So coming back to Abhinavagupta, although some of his students consider him to be an avatara of Dakshinamurti, it's important that he doesn't think that. You know, he just says, I am not making anything up right now. I'm just going to say what is already there in the Malini Vijayotara Tantra. And that claim is preposterous because so much of what he says is not there in the Malini Vijayotara Tantra. But I think he's making a case for it. And that's all that we can ever do. We can only present what we feel like presenting, and to the best of our ability, we try to be aligned with the lineage. And then we try to like ground our claims in the lineage. And somehow, because of that move that Abhinavagupta makes, you get both innovation and tradition. And it's important to note that the Malini Vijayotara is revealed by Shiva, and therefore it has the highest authority. Revealed by Shiva meaning revealed by reality. It is free of all the flaws of power-hungry individuals who fall from time to time. It's like just immaculate. The Malini Vijayotara Tantra, like the other Tantras, are immaculate in that they're revealed by Lord Shiva. So therefore Abhinavagupta is appealing to authority. He's appealing to an authority of a deity, and here deity means reality, but that authority is encapsulated in a text. So therefore, I will repeat again, as I did on Thursday, the Tantric tradition rests upon the Tantras, which are texts. The Tantric tradition is a scriptural and exegetical movement that appeared in the Indic continent, and it's based on these texts, which are themselves based on other texts called the Vedas, the Upanishads. So the Tantric tradition with its Agamas and the Vaidika tradition with its Vedas is essentially a textual tradition. And by text isn't necessarily meant the written word, also the spoken word, the oral transmission and the written transmission. These are the textual traditions that we cannot opt out of if we want to be part of those traditions. We must interact with the texts of those traditions in order to be tantrikas. And so that's really all we have to go off of, right? The text. So then I'm going to close this with a threefold epistemology. The first thing is Sadguru, the second thing is Sadagama, and the third thing is Sattarka. Sadguru refers to sometimes the individual, but I would read that as how the Guru Gita reads it, as Brahmananda Paramasukadam Kevalam Jnanamurtim Dvandvatitam Gaganadarisham. So the Sadguru is, I'm going to argue, your own experience, which, by the way, is guided and mediated and sometimes induced by a person. But it's always going to be your own experience, and you're only ever accountable to that and to yourself. And so even if an individual induces that experience, it is still your experience. What you get out of it and what you make of it is always up to you. No individual can tell you what to feel. And what you feel, no individual can take away from you or change. ideally. That's called Sadguru. The second thing is called Sadagama. What you experienced is not necessarily idiosyncratic. It can be corroborated against the agamas, the texts, which have authority insofar as they're revealed by a non-human entity, by a divine entity like Shiva, who, as you know, means reality, Brahman, the absolute nature of reality. So that Sadagama is important, because if you just have experiences and you don't have texts, you might feel alone and isolated, and you might have no context for your experiences. But thanks to the text, your experiences can be corroborated. You feel like, oh, okay, I'm not crazy, or like, oh, I am crazy, but so are all these other people. And so I would say those two together, the guru and the text. And if you want to read guru as a person, this is also important. A person should not teach outside of the text, because then there's no way to like check and balance what they're saying. If people on the internet are saying that I'm making claims that don't sit with the lineage, that's good actually. It's good, because then that gives me a chance to point to text and say, look, as we've been doing, here it is. This is the evidence and justification for the claim, though I will have to admit that I'm interpreting. That's my job. An acharya interprets, but not in a free vacuum. An acharya interprets not based on idiosyncrasy or any like agenda. Arguably, the acharya interprets based on a text. So the texts are important to keep individuals in check, and individuals are important to demonstrate the texts. So an individual is like a living example of the text, because ideally they've practiced the text and have achieved some level of spiritual nourishment from it. And so therefore they validate the text, and the texts validate them. And together you have a nice system of accountability between the individual and the non-individual or communal effort of scripture making. And arguably no humans make scriptures. They just interpret and present scriptures that are revealed to them. So you see what we have here? We have institutions in two senses. One, a human, and the other, a non-human communal textual base. So these two institutions will check and balance one another. But if you take aside the institution, you have faith-based and experience-based claims here. You base your knowledge off experience in the context of Sadguru. And by the way, even if you use the word guru to mean another person, it's still your experience of that person that is called the guru. You see, this is very important. The person is not the guru. Your experience of the person is guru. So please allow me to reinterpret the word Sadguru to mean your personal experience. This is perhaps what Buddha meant by Atma Dipo Bhavati, be a light unto thyself. You know, I think Americans really misunderstand this statement. They're too individualist about it. They say, okay, that means I won't learn from anybody. Hare, if you don't expose yourself to new ideas, if you don't apprentice yourself, if you don't study under somebody or like a text, like how will you, I mean, what will you do? You'll be so boring. Like, you know, you won't have anything to base your unique personality off of. A person like Abhinavagupta or Ramakrishna, heck, a good musician, takes the time to learn carefully what came before. They apprentice themselves to others, and then based on that they can articulate their own individual sense. So I think Americans are too fast to kick out the guru because of bad experiences in the 70s with cults of personality. But at the same time, they can also be too quick to accept the role of an individual as like Lord and Savior, which is, I think, a artifact of Christianity. Everybody wants a Jesus because they understand Jesus to be a human being that can do all of their work for them, like absolve them of their sins or something. Yet, Jesus might refer to a reality, Christ consciousness, if you will. So, even if there's a person in front of you, it's not that person who is the guru. It is your experience of that person who is a guru. And therefore, that person can be valuable because they can provide or induce that experience. But even without that person, the experience is still called the guru. So, at no point, people are always like, when will I find my guru? That, to me, immediately indicates, I think, the great cultural failure in the way India has presented Guru Yoga to you. I'm sorry that so many brown men have come to this country and taken you for a ride. Some of them were legit, but a lot of times we just saw a bunch of gullible white people and we're like, we'll make a quick buck over there. Call it reparations, you guys. No, my point here is that, like, I'm sorry you thought it was a person. I'm sorry the whole time you were expecting a Jesus figure to come and absolve you of all your sins. But at the same time, don't be so quick to say it's not a person either, and close yourself off to the experience that a person can induce. At every single moment, you are with your guru. For the word Sadguru refers to your intimate experience of reality, which is always valid and true at every level of reality. But that is not in a vacuum. That's checked and balanced against this other thing called Sadagama. Right? Sadagama means scripture, which we actually have to read in order to be able to benefit from. So like, I've been presenting these epistemological structures as a way of accountability and as a way of safeguard and a way of checks and balances. But some of the response that I see on the internet, it's like clearly the case that's lost upon some of our audiences. Like they don't understand that there is a system, and I've been presenting it, but we cannot benefit from it, friends, if you don't use it. If you don't learn Sanskrit, and if you don't interact with the text, you will never be able to know if what I'm saying is idiosyncratic or not. It's not, and I can prove it, but you need to have some Sanskrit. And more importantly, you need to be willing to go to the text that I'm talking about, right? I'm not just saying these texts to intimidate you. I'm not just saying a bunch of Sanskrit words at you. I'm offering means of accountability. But you have to take it up. You have to use those means of accountability to hold me accountable as an individual. And more importantly, you have to take responsibility not to give any individual more authority than they have. No individual has authority over you. You are accountable only to yourself. The Sadguru is not a person, but the experience you have with a person or with anything, with reality. When you corroborate that against Agama, now you have a really good working spirituality. The Agama you take on faith. Right? Faith means you just take on faith that these tantras and agamas were revealed by Lord Shiva, that the Vedas were revealed by reality, or that they are reality. That's a faith-based claim. You just accept the agamas as true and real and good. But the third thing I love, the third thing is my favorite, arguably, and that's called sattarka, reasoning. Reasoning, we argue, is the most important thing because it's the buddhi, it's the action of the higher intellect. And it's not easy to do, and it's something worth developing and cultivating. Because reasoning is what you use to adjudicate the claims of the agama, and more importantly, interpret the experience that you're having. So the Sadguru and the Sadagama aspects of this tripartite epistemology is ultimately going to be grounded in sattarka, reasoning. But this reasoning is not just mere polemical reasoning, or it's not just like analytical or logical. It's a deep kind of intuitive, instinctive, inquisitive reasoning that takes things on faith but is willing to question that faith. And then based on logic and analytical reasoning, you can actually protect yourself in many ways. And again, you can reason in circles. What is it? Anadhisthana iti tarkaha. That which has no ground is called reason. There are places where you can criticize reason for being ultimately circular. Kantian antinomians or whatever. Antinomism, but antinomian, whatever. But Zen koans or whatever. But we in the Tantric tradition, especially in Abhinavagupta's side of the fence, we really believe in reason, the power of reason. So if we have materials in front of us, sadagama, if we have our own experience, then finally we add reason. Notice we have three checks and balances. Reasoning plus text plus individual or plus your individual experience. Sadguru, Sadagama, Sattarka. These were the three things that I presented in the How to Stay Safe in Tantra lecture. So when you have these three things and you use them all together in your tantric studies, it mitigates the influence that any one of these things have over any other one of these things. So the problem in America, what I think I've noticed from watching some documentaries and things, is that we abandon Sadagama and Sattarka if there's a Sadguru who is like charismatic enough. Right? Or we abandon Sadguru and Sattarka if we have just a blind faith in the texts. So like that's a matter of emphasis. We sacrifice some of these things in favor of others. But if we have all three of them, then we're safest. But you cannot deny that each and every one of us will have a preference for one or the other. For me, the agamas, I like them very much. And so I like using tarka and agama mainly. You know, like I'm less likely to appeal to experience, or rather try to like induce experiences like Shaktipata type things. Or I'm not really that interested in hearing about your experience or telling you mine. You know, like that's just personal. And more interested, I'm more importantly, I'm not interested in being a guru or playing the role of being your guru. And more importantly, I'm not interested in the claims as to what that means for the disciple. Like the disciple must always do what the guru tells them to do. Like all that stuff seems too authoritarian and institutional for me. You know, but the text, there's a freedom to the text because you can read them for yourself. You can learn and study on your own. And there's something liberating and democratic about tarka, reasoning. And so I'm always willing to engage in hours-long debate. I'll reason anything out with you. And more importantly, I love to study texts together. So those two things to me are going to be my emphasis. You know, as opposed to some other lineages might be more guru-based, more like diksha-based. So some people are like, oh, when am I going to find my guru? That's just not an interesting question to me. Or questions like, oh, are you my guru? Again, not an interesting question. A more interesting question is, what text should I study? And more importantly, what does the text mean? Because ultimately, if Tantra is about text, you have everything you need to practice Tantra. And technically, Lord Shiva alone is the guru. So if you go to a text and you get a mantra for the text, you think that won't work. It's people that are trying to sell you things that have told you that won't work. You must have very little faith in Shiva and in a text, if you're then going to say, oh, I can't get anything from a text. You know, if somebody accuses me of book learning, here's what I will reply. What books did I read? Yes, I read books. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I read books and I'm now teaching based on the books that I read. But I didn't just read any books, you guys. I read the Tantras. I read the Agamas. I read the Upanishads. I mean, I can't say this in the past tense. I'm reading them. You know, and wait, you guys. These are revealed by Lord Shiva. It blew my mind that this is lost upon so many people, that like Lord Shiva revealed the Tantras. So then when you look at the Tantras and read them in Sanskrit and like in other languages, and you try to like live according to what the Tantra says, that's all that you can do, right? Like you can look at the Tantra. You can do what the Tantra says. And I always thought that's what you were supposed to do. Like if you have a Tantra, and in that Tantra Lord Shiva tells you what to do, shouldn't you just do that? Do you need to wait for a human being to come and tell you to do that? Because if a human being comes, won't they just tell you to do what the text told you to? This was my experience growing up as a Shaiva, like Nishant Selvalingam, whose grandfather was Selvalingam, whose father was Selvalingam Sodhilingam, whose father was Sodhilingam Vaitalingam, whose father was Vaitalingam Nagalingam. As someone who's been in a generational Shaiva family, like it's just a no-brainer to us that the Tantras are sacred. They're revealed by Lord Shiva. And so if my human guru is to tell me anything, all he's going to tell me is to read the Tantra and do what the Tantra says. So that's all I do and all I encourage you to do, arguably. So you cannot then say, oh, this is just book learning, or this is just from a book. There's no authority. There is authority. The authority is from Shiva, and the Tantras inherently have authority. That's my response to the claim that this is all just from a book. Yes, it is, and thank God. Thank God we have books, and it's God's books, you know. So I think that's so much to say about that. Anybody can study Tantra. You don't need to wait for a human to give you permission. You know, you don't need to wait for someone to teach you Kaula Marga or Vamachara, to practice Kaula Marga or Vamachara. If you want to do it, if it is your heart's desire, and Mother alone put that desire in your heart, then she will also bring you the texts that you need, not necessarily the people that will give you permission to read those texts. I argue you have no business practicing Kaulachara or Vamachara if you're the kind of person that waits around for permission. It's the wrong bhava. And again, we can have a conversation about bhava. Bhava is important, and every bhava is valid. So you cannot judge another person's bhava based on your own. If you have a bhava that says, I want someone to tell me what to do, or I want like something more institutional, I want a certificate on the wall before I can accept someone as an authority, that's valid actually. It's called pashu bhava, and that's not to be pejorative. Again, if you think, oh my God, why should I kill animals? Why should I drink wine? Why should I worship the human body? Again, that's perfectly valid. That's called divya bhava. I don't happen to have either of those bhavas. I have vira bhava. And because of that, I like vira bhava texts. And so that cannot be condemned on the basis of another bhava. And so I should never condemn any bhava. And other bhavas cannot condemn this one insofar as there are texts, like legit traditional sources for this bhava and for this tradition. So I was shocked when I found that there were people who worshipped Kali who had a problem with animal sacrifice or a problem with panchamakara, because these things are deeply spiritually nourishing for certain individuals, not for all individuals. So coming back to Sri Ramakrishna then, did Sri Ramakrishna teach these things? Who can say? Did he practice these things? Absolutely. And arguably, once he practiced them, it is our faith that he legitimized them. By practicing them, he demonstrates that his genuine spiritual interest, his sincere spiritual interest, brought him to those texts. And when he practiced those texts, he achieved results. So they must work for somebody. And if they work for somebody, then don't you think there might have been people that came to Sri Ramakrishna for whom it did work, to whom he did teach it? It's just not something that maybe Belrumat can present publicly. And nor should they, because the Ramakrishna mission has such a prestigious reputation all around the world. But never for once think that any one tradition has a monopoly on Ramakrishna. He who is illimitable and infinite. He who is representation for God, God the Mother, who accepts all forms and all modes. So what the bohemians are doing out in the forest, and what the Kaula Margins are doing out in the Smashan, is not so different actually. And it seems eccentric, it seems innovative, it seems contrary to the traditional and conventional view. And maybe that's all right. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanam. Astu. Jai Ma.